There exists a peculiar state of consciousness that occurs during sleep, wherein the dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming while the dream itself continues to unfold around them. And in this awareness, many people report the ability to exert varying degrees of control over the dream's narrative, the environment, and even their own actions within that fabricated reality. This phenomenon, known as lucid dreaming, has been documented across cultures and throughout history, with ancient texts from Tibet, India, and indigenous traditions describing techniques for achieving and maintaining this state, treating it as both a spiritual practice and a method for personal exploration. Those who experience lucid dreams describe a sensation of heightened clarity coupled with the simultaneous knowledge that nothing they perceive is actually real, that the ground beneath their feet exists only as a neural firing pattern, that the people they interact with are merely constructs of their own sleeping mind, and yet they continue to engage with this reality as though it matters, making decisions and taking actions within a world they intellectually understand to be non-existent. The mechanism behind lucid dreaming appears to involve a particular activation pattern in the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain associated with metacognition and self-awareness, allowing the sleeping mind to simultaneously maintain the dream while observing it, creating a strange duality where consciousness is both embedded within the dream and standing apart from it, watching itself. Researchers have found that certain brain regions show increased activity during lucid dreams compared to regular dreams, particularly areas involved in self-reflection and reality testing, suggesting that the brain is essentially monitoring its own processes while simultaneously being deceived by them. Yet despite our understanding of the neural correlates involved, the lucid dream remains a profoundly mysterious experience, one that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the boundaries between awareness and unconsciousness. Many people spend months or years developing techniques to induce lucidity, using reality checks throughout the day, maintaining dream journals, or employing mnemonic devices, treating the ability to become conscious within a dream as though it were a valuable skill worthy of dedicated practice. Consider the experience of falling asleep on an ordinary Tuesday evening, your mind drifting into the familiar landscape of dreams where logic dissolves and narrative flows without constraint, and then waking the following morning with a peculiar sense of recognition that somehow, in some inexplicable way, you have already witnessed the events now unfolding around you. Events that seem to match with uncanny precision the fragmentary images and conversations that flickered through your sleeping consciousness hours before, a phenomenon that has captivated human imagination for millennia and continues to appear in the testimonies of ordinary people who swear they have glimpsed the future while sleeping. The theory of precognitive dreams suggests that during sleep, when the conscious mind retreats and the brain enters its various stages of rest and rapid eye movement, something extraordinary might occur, a kind of temporal displacement where the barrier between present and future becomes somehow permeable, allowing glimpses of events not yet arrived to seep backward through time and manifest themselves as dream imagery, symbols, and narratives that our sleeping mind struggles to process and encode into memory. From a psychological perspective, however, what might actually be happening is far more subtle and rooted in the mechanics of memory, pattern recognition, and confirmation bias, as our brains are essentially prediction machines constantly processing vast amounts of information both consciously and unconsciously, analyzing patterns in behavior, weather, social dynamics, and countless other variables, and when we dream, we are drawing upon all this accumulated predictive data, generating scenarios that feel novel but are actually extrapolations of patterns we have already observed. And when one of these extrapolations happens to align with reality, we remember it with startling clarity while conveniently forgetting the thousands of dreams that never came true. The persistence of precognitive dream beliefs, despite the absence of scientifically validated evidence, speaks to something deeply human, a fundamental desire to believe that consciousness possesses hidden depths, and that sleep is not merely a period of downtime, but rather a gateway to something transcendent, and we have culturally normalized these experiences through literature, film, and shared anecdotes, treating them as windows into extraordinary possibilities rather than as the natural outputs of a brain engaged in pattern prediction and creative synthesis, allowing the enchanting notion of precognitive dreams to maintain its place in our collective consciousness. Consider the experience of falling asleep at night after a day filled with frustrations, conflicts, rejections, or unmet desires, only to find yourself in dreams where these exact scenarios resolve themselves in your favor, where the person who rejected you suddenly accepts you, where the argument you lost is won decisively, where the humiliation you suffered is reversed into triumph and vindication. This phenomenon, which Sigmund Freud termed wish fulfillment, suggests that our dreams serve as a psychological theater where our unconscious mind stages elaborate productions designed to satisfy the desires and needs that waking life refuses to grant us. According to this framework, dreams are not random neurological noise or meaningless image sequences, but rather carefully constructed narratives generated by our deepest psychological drives, particularly those that have been repressed, censored, or frustrated during our waking hours. The mechanism operates on a relatively straightforward principle. The conscious mind maintains various social inhibitions, moral constraints, and reality-based limitations that prevent us from acting on every impulse, every desire, every fantasy that emerges within us throughout the day. Our jobs demand professional behavior, our relationships require compromise and restraint, our social standing depends on conforming to acceptable norms, and the simple physics of reality means we cannot always achieve what we want. Yet our unconscious mind does not accept these limitations, does not recognize these boundaries, does not care about the rules and restrictions that govern waking life. So when we sleep and the rational gatekeeping functions of consciousness relax, the unconscious takes its opportunity to construct dreams wherein all these frustrated wishes can be expressed and satisfied in symbolic or direct form. The person you secretly resent appears in your dream apologizing profusely. The achievement you failed at is suddenly yours. The romantic interest that rejected you is now desperately pursuing you. What makes this theory particularly interesting is how thoroughly it has persisted despite significant challenges from modern neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and brain imaging studies that suggest dreams may not be narratives at all, but rather the brain's attempt to make sense of random neural firing patterns during REM sleep. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of two people engaged in a heated disagreement within a dream, where one person insists upon a particular version of events while the other contradicts them with equal conviction, and both feel entirely justified in their opposing positions even though they are literally the same consciousness, experiencing both sides of the argument simultaneously. Within the dream state, this logical impossibility feels completely reasonable, and the dreamer maintains two distinct perspectives at once, each believing itself to be correct, each marshaling evidence and emotion to support its case, until the dreamer awakens and suddenly recognizes the absurdity of having argued with themselves about something that never actually occurred. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to involve the dream state's unique relationship with causality and identity, wherein the brain generates multiple narrative threads without the usual supervisory function that maintains coherent selfhood during waking life. When we are awake, our sense of continuous identity prevents us from genuinely believing two contradictory things simultaneously, because a unified conscious observer recognizes the contradiction immediately. But during dreams, the neural architecture responsible for integrating information across different brain regions operates in a fundamentally different mode, allowing separate simulations to run in parallel without cross-checking against a central authority. Each faction within the dream argument draws upon memory fragments, emotional associations, and invented details that feel authentic in the moment, creating a convincing sense that each perspective has legitimate grounds for certainty. What remains strange and unexplained is how we accept this internal debate as real while dreaming, invest emotional energy into defending our dream position, feel genuine frustration or indignation at the dream other's stubbornness, and yet upon waking, can immediately see the entire structure as a kind of neurological theater with no actual stakes. Some theorists suggest that the persistence of dream arguments despite their logical impossibility reveals something fundamental about how human beings construct certainty itself, proposing that perhaps our waking convictions operate through similar mechanisms of selective evidence gathering and emotional investment rather than pure logical necessity, and that our sense of being right might be similarly divorced from objective truth, even when we are fully conscious and convinced of our own rationality. Consider the moment when two people wake up simultaneously and begin to recount their dreams to one another, only to discover that they have experienced remarkably similar imagery, encountered the same symbolic figures, or found themselves navigating nearly identical dreamscapes during the exact same night. This phenomenon, known as shared dreaming, represents one of the most compelling yet scientifically contentious aspects of human sleep consciousness, and it occurs with sufficient regularity that thousands of individuals across the globe have documented instances where their nocturnal visions seem to intersect with those of another person. The typical shared dream scenario involves intimate partners, close family members, or long-term friends who report dreaming about the same locations, meeting the same mysterious characters, or experiencing parallel narrative arcs that could not have been deliberately coordinated beforehand. Sometimes the sharing extends beyond mere similarity and ventures into what participants describe as a form of communication or mutual presence within the dream space itself, where both dreamers feel they were actively aware of each other's consciousness during their sleep. From a neurological perspective, sleep science has struggled to explain how two separate brains, each operating in their own isolated biological chambers, could somehow synchronize their electrical activity to such a degree that their generated dream content would align in meaningful ways. The mechanisms proposed by researchers typically involve either remarkable coincidence multiplied by selective memory and confirmation bias, wherein we naturally emphasize the few instances where dreams overlap while forgetting the countless nights when they diverge entirely, or alternatively, they suggest that people who share intimate bonds and similar daily experiences would naturally generate thematically related dreams simply because they occupy overlapping psychological and emotional spaces. Yet despite these rational explanations, the persistence of shared dreaming reports across centuries and cultures suggests that something compelling about the human experience during sleep continues to defy our current understanding. And perhaps the very act of sleeping near another person, of sharing the same physical space and emotional rhythms for hours each night, creates some subtle resonance between minds that our instruments have not yet been sophisticated enough to measure or detect. Consider the experience of waking in the dead of night with a sudden, jarring awareness that your body refuses to move, that your limbs have become heavy as stone and utterly unresponsive to the frantic commands your conscious mind is sending down through your nervous system. And imagine the primal terror that accompanies this realization as you lie there in the darkness, your eyes perhaps open but your vision swimming with hallucinations, shadows that seem to breathe and take on forms of their own. Sometimes perceived as a presence in the room, sometimes as a weight pressing down upon your chest with the force of an invisible hand or creature, and you cannot scream because your vocal cords are similarly paralyzed, cannot move because your body exists in a state of complete muscular shutdown, a condition that typically lasts anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, though it feels like an eternity when you are trapped within it. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is actually grounded in the neuroscience of sleep itself, particularly in the stage known as rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep, when your brain is most active and dreams are most vivid and most likely to occur. And during this stage, your body enters a state of atonia, a temporary paralysis of the voluntary muscles that is believed to be a protective mechanism preventing you from acting out your dreams, from flailing your limbs about and potentially injuring yourself as your mind conjures increasingly elaborate and immersive scenarios. Occasionally, this protective mechanism malfunctions or becomes desynchronized with your waking consciousness, so that your mind returns to awareness while your body remains locked in the atonia of sleep, leaving you conscious and aware and terrified but utterly unable to move, unable to vocalize, unable to do anything but experience the horror of apparent helplessness, and your brain, in this state of profound confusion and fear, begins to interpret the strange sensations and the darkness and your own rapid heartbeat as evidence of a threat, generating hallucinations that feel absolutely real, entities that seem to occupy the room with you, that seem to press down upon you, that seem to watch you with malevolent intent. Imagine waking up in your bedroom, feeling the sheets beneath your skin, hearing the ambient sounds of morning, noticing the familiar arrangement of furniture and the quality of light filtering through your windows. You sit up slowly, perhaps checking your phone or looking at the clock, and everything feels entirely authentic and real, complete with the sensory texture of genuine wakefulness. You might even go through an entire morning routine, splashing water on your face, making coffee, getting dressed, engaging in conversations with people who seem fully present and responsive. Yet at some point, often hours into this experience, something shifts, and you realize with startling clarity that you have not actually awakened at all, but rather remained trapped within the dream itself, experiencing what researchers and scholars have termed a false awakening. This phenomenon represents one of the mind's most peculiar tricks, a layering of consciousness, where the brain constructs an entirely convincing simulation of the waking world while you remain fundamentally asleep, trapped in the subjective experience of having escaped sleep's grasp. The psychological mechanism underlying false awakenings appears to stem from the brain's extraordinary capacity to generate complete sensory environments without any external stimulus whatsoever. During rapid eye movement sleep, the neural regions responsible for processing sensory information and constructing our sense of reality remain highly active, yet the brain stem regions that typically ground us in external reality are quieted, creating a strange dissociation where the mind generates vivid, coherent experiences entirely from internal sources. When someone experiences a false awakening, the brain has essentially constructed a convincing facsimile of waking consciousness, maintaining internal consistency and sensory coherence for what might span anywhere from a few minutes to what feels like several hours of subjective time. The prefrontal cortex, which normally serves as our reality checker, remains partially suppressed during dreaming, which explains why obvious logical inconsistencies often fail to trigger recognition during false awakenings, why clocks might display impossible times, or why conversations might follow nonsensical trajectories without prompting immediate doubt. Picture yourself lying in bed at 3 in the morning, completely paralyzed by vivid hallucinations of shadowy figures standing in your doorway, your heart racing uncontrollably, yet you cannot move a single muscle or call out for help. This is the activation synthesis hypothesis in its most unsettling manifestation, a theory that fundamentally challenges our understanding of what dreams actually are and where they originate within the architecture of our sleeping brains. During the rapid eye movement phase of sleep, when your eyes dart back and forth beneath closed lids, your brainstem becomes extraordinarily active, flooding your consciousness with intense bursts of neural activity and neurochemical signals that cascade through regions responsible for emotion, memory, and sensory perception. Yet simultaneously your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logic and rational thought, becomes dramatically suppressed and quieted into a state of near dormancy. According to this theory, your brain is not receiving meaningful information from the external world during these REM periods, so instead it attempts to construct a coherent narrative, a story that makes sense of all the random electrical firing and chemical chaos happening inside your skull, synthesizing these fragmented neural signals into the bizarre and emotionally intense dreams you experience when you awaken. The activation synthesis hypothesis suggests that dreams are essentially your brain's attempt to create meaning from meaninglessness, to impose order upon neurological noise, rather than being messages from your unconscious or windows into your deepest psychological truths, as earlier theorists like Sigmund Freud had proposed with such confidence. Yet despite decades of neuroscientific research supporting this biological mechanism, despite our understanding of the exact neurochemistry and neural pathways involved, people continue to search for symbolic meaning in their dreams, continue to consult dream interpretation guides, and speak with therapists about dream symbolism, continue to wake up convinced that their nightmare about missing teeth or being chased held some profound personal significance. As though the brain's desperate attempt to rationalize random neural activity must surely conceal a deeper truth about their waking lives. Imagine lying in bed at 3 in the morning, caught in that peculiar state where you cannot quite distinguish whether you are awake or dreaming, and in that moment you remember a story you once read about a Chinese philosopher named Zhuangzi who dreamed he was a butterfly, only to wake and wonder if perhaps he was actually a butterfly dreaming he was a man. This ancient thought experiment, which emerged from Taoist philosophy over 2,000 years ago, continues to haunt our modern understanding of consciousness and identity in ways that are far more unsettling than most people realize. The original narrative describes Zhuangzi as experiencing such a vivid and immersive dream where he fluttered about as a delicate butterfly, moving from flower to flower with a butterfly's concerns and butterfly's perspective, that when he awakened, he could no longer be certain which state represented his true existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates on the principle of narrative continuity, the way our minds construct a seamless story of identity regardless of the actual state of consciousness we inhabit at any given moment. When you dream, your brain creates an entire world complete with sensations, emotions, and a sense of self that feels absolutely convincing in the moment. And when you wake, you simply accept that waking consciousness is the real one without any objective way to verify this claim. The unsettling truth is that both states employ identical neural mechanisms for creating the illusion of a unified self experiencing a coherent reality, which means there is technically no logical reason to privilege waking consciousness over dreaming consciousness as more legitimate or authentic. What makes this thought experiment persist despite our cultural dismissal of it as mere philosophical whimsy is that it taps into a fundamental uncertainty that we have learned to suppress through social conditioning and habitual thinking, yet it never truly disappears from the human psyche. We have normalized the division between dreams and waking life so thoroughly that we treat them as obviously different categories. Yet every night we prove to ourselves that consciousness can generate equally convincing realities regardless of which side of that division we occupy, and this contradiction remains unresolved in neuroscience and philosophy alike. The butterfly metaphor becomes even more disorienting when you consider that Zhuangzi himself may have intended not a crisis of identity, but rather a liberation from the illusion that identity matters at all, that perhaps the real insight is not which state is real. Consider the experience of being chased through an unfamiliar landscape by something you cannot quite identify, your legs moving with the peculiar sluggishness that only exists in dreams, your heart racing with genuine physiological alarm even as your conscious mind sleeps. And then suddenly you are falling from an impossible height or drowning in an endless expanse of water, and each sensation feels devastatingly real despite the absurdity of the scenario. And when you wake, your pulse is still elevated, and your body is covered in a thin layer of perspiration. This phenomenon occurs with such regularity across human populations that it seems almost universal in its expression, and yet we rarely pause to consider why our sleeping minds would construct such elaborate experiences of mortal danger. The threat simulation theory proposes that dreams function essentially as an ancient biological flight simulator, a mechanism by which the brain rehearses responses to threatening situations without the actual cost of encountering real danger, allowing us to practice defensive behaviors and threat recognition in a consequence-free environment where failure results only in waking rather than death. The theory suggests that our ancestors who possessed brains capable of running these nocturnal threat simulations gained significant survival advantages, as they could encounter predators, hostile tribes, environmental hazards, and social rejection repeatedly in sleep and develop faster, more intuitive responses when these threats manifested in waking life. The brain, operating under this evolutionary logic, would have been selected to generate scenarios that matched the statistical likelihood of threats in ancestral environments, which explains why flying dreams or scenarios involving social humiliation persist despite being unlikely threats in modern contexts, because our neurobiology has not yet caught up to our circumstances. What remains curious is that we continue to experience these threat simulations with such emotional intensity even now, when most of us face no genuine predators or life-threatening dangers during our sleeping hours, suggesting that the mechanism remains active despite its original adaptive purpose having largely disappeared, a relic of evolutionary design that continues to execute its programming regardless of whether the modern environment demands it. Yet this persistence itself may serve a purpose we have not fully recognized: the maintenance of psychological resilience through regular exposure to manageable adversity, keeping our threat detection systems calibrated even in the absence of genuine danger. Consider the experience of encountering a symbol in your dream that feels ancient and profound, a figure or archetype that seems to carry weight beyond your personal memories, something that speaks to a shared human understanding that exists nowhere in your conscious mind and nowhere in your lived experience. Carl Jung proposed that beneath the personal unconscious, which contains repressed individual memories and forgotten experiences, there exists a deeper layer he called the collective unconscious, a psychological substrate that all human beings share regardless of culture, geography, or historical period. This collective unconscious, according to Jungian theory, contains universal patterns of human experience that he termed archetypes, fundamental symbols and character types that emerge repeatedly across mythology, religion, art, and literature throughout human civilization. The wise old mentor appears in stories from ancient Mesopotamia to modern Hollywood films. The shadow self, the darker reflection of our conscious identity, manifests in folklore and contemporary psychology alike. The Great Mother, the hero's journey, the wise fool, these patterns repeat endlessly across separated cultures with striking similarity, and Jung believed these repetitions occur because they are imprinted in the collective unconscious that all humans access. In dreams, these archetypes allegedly surface without conscious effort, which would explain why people from entirely different backgrounds sometimes report similar symbolic experiences, why certain mythological figures resonate across centuries, why particular dream imagery feels universally recognizable. The mechanism proposed suggests that human consciousness itself evolved within a shared psychological space, that just as all humans share biological structures inherited from evolutionary history, so too do all humans inherit psychological structures, blueprints of meaning and symbol that shape how we process experience. Yet despite its influence on psychology and arts, the collective unconscious remains remarkably difficult to verify scientifically, existing more as a compelling metaphor than a measurable phenomenon, and we continue teaching it in universities and referencing it in therapy because it provides a framework for understanding why human symbols feel transcendent, why myths persist, why we dream in a language that somehow transcends individual experience. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of waking each morning with only fragmented memories of your dreams, those strange narratives that consumed your sleeping mind just hours before, now dissolved into hazy impressions and forgotten details that slip away like water through clenched fingers. We experience this universal condition with such regularity that we have accepted it as normal, as inevitable, yet there exists a counterintuitive theory suggesting that this forgetting is not a failure of memory, but rather the precise function that dreaming serves. According to this concept, we dream not to preserve information or to process emotions, but fundamentally to purge ourselves of unnecessary thoughts, intrusive memories, and the accumulated mental clutter that would otherwise burden our waking consciousness. The theory proposes that our brains generate dreams as a mechanism for active forgetting, a deliberate neural pruning that removes the trivial, the redundant, and the potentially disruptive from our cognitive systems. During waking hours, our minds absorb countless sensory inputs, half-remembered conversations, fragments of information that hold little significance or relevance to our survival and well-being, yet these minor details accumulate and create noise within our neural networks. The sleeping brain, according to this perspective, engages in a systematic housekeeping process where dreams serve as the means by which irrelevant information is activated and then deliberately cleared away, preventing these forgotten matters from cluttering our working memory and hampering our daytime cognitive function. The mechanism operates through a kind of neural activation during REM sleep, where these marginalia of consciousness are briefly brought to the surface, played out in the bizarre, nonsensical storylines we experience as dreams, and then systematically dismantled and discarded, leaving no trace behind. We have normalized this theory despite its disturbing implications, because it offers an elegant explanation for why dreams seem so impossible to remember and why trying to hold on to their details causes them to evaporate more rapidly. The forgetting in this framework becomes not a limitation of the dreaming process but its fundamental purpose, suggesting that a good night's sleep leaves us with a cleaner, more efficient mind precisely because we have forgotten so thoroughly. Imagine lying perfectly still in your bed in the deep silence of night, your body growing heavier and heavier, sinking into the mattress as your consciousness begins to drift somewhere else entirely. You feel a strange vibration coursing through your limbs, a humming sensation that seems to emanate from within your very bones, and then without warning, you experience what practitioners describe as a separation from your physical form. Your consciousness, your essential self, seems to lift away from your body like a leaf rising on an invisible current of air, and suddenly you are floating above your bed, looking down at your own sleeping figure below. You can see the room from this new vantage point, move freely through walls and ceilings, travel across vast distances instantaneously, and explore realms that feel utterly real and tactile, even though you know your body remains locked in sleep back on that distant mattress. This phenomenon, known as astral projection or out-of-body experience, has been reported consistently across cultures and throughout history, described by people from completely different walks of life who claim to have experienced the sensation of their consciousness existing independently from their physical bodies. The psychological and neurological mechanisms underlying these experiences have become increasingly clear to researchers studying consciousness and sleep phenomena. What people interpret as their astral body separating from their physical form is actually a profound disruption of the brain's ability to integrate sensory information about the body's location and boundaries. During certain stages of sleep, particularly in the transition between wakefulness and sleep, the brain's motor cortex becomes temporarily paralyzed to prevent your body from acting out your dreams, a phenomenon called sleep paralysis. Simultaneously, your visual cortex and spatial awareness systems remain partially active, creating a peculiar state where your consciousness is awake enough to perceive the world, but your body cannot move. In this disorienting neurological condition, the brain constructs a spatial map based on memory rather than actual sensory input, and your consciousness, unable to feel or locate its body through normal proprioceptive channels, interprets itself as existing in a different location entirely. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who broke away from Freud's theories, proposed that deep within the human unconscious mind exists a layer far more universal than personal experience, a collective repository of ancestral memory and symbolic patterns that transcend individual psychology and culture, and he called these patterns archetypes, primordial images and characters that recur across mythology, literature, religion, and dreams throughout human civilization, regardless of geography or historical period. When we dream, Jung believed we are tapping into this vast collective unconscious, encountering figures like the shadow, representing our repressed and rejected aspects, the wise old man or woman offering guidance and wisdom, the innocent seeking safety and happiness, the lover driven by connection and intimacy, the hero embarking on courageous quests, the caregiver motivated by compassion, and countless others. Each carrying archetypal weight that resonates in our psyche at levels we cannot consciously access or fully comprehend. The mechanism behind this phenomenon, according to Jungian theory, rests on the idea that humanity shares common psychological structures and experiences that have been encoded into our neural architecture through evolutionary time, meaning that fear of death, the search for meaning, the struggle between good and evil, and the journey toward self-discovery are not invented by individual cultures, but rather discovered and expressed through the universal language of archetypes. Which is why a mother figure in a Mesopotamian dream operates psychologically identically to a mother figure in a modern American dream, why the hero's journey appears in ancient epics and contemporary films alike, and why certain dream symbols carry intuitive meaning we recognize without being explicitly taught. What persists as extraordinary about this theory, despite decades of psychological science moving toward neurobiology and empiricism, is that archetypes continue to feel profoundly true when we experience them in our dreams, and we accept without question that our unconscious mind speaks in the symbolic language of universal characters and mythological narratives. Normalizing the idea that our dreams are not merely personal processing, but connections to something vast and impersonal that exists within all human minds across time and space, making sleep a nightly descent into the depths of our species' collective memory. Consider for a moment the peculiar experience of becoming lucid within a dream, that strange moment when you suddenly realize that you are not awake in the world, but rather suspended in your own unconscious theater, yet you remain trapped within it nonetheless, unable to simply will yourself back to consciousness. This phenomenon has given rise to an extraordinary theory that exists somewhere between theology and neuroscience, a concept that suggests perhaps we are not the dreamers at all, but rather the dreamed, that consciousness itself might be the dream of some vast intelligence that exists at a level of reality so far removed from our own that we cannot even perceive it. The theory proposes that what we experience as our waking life is merely one layer of dreaming within an infinite hierarchy of consciousness, each level dreaming the level below it, and what we call reality is simply the dream content of a being so infinitely advanced and incomprehensibly vast that to it, our entire universe unfolds like a passing thought during sleep. When you experience a dream within a dream, that nested structure where you wake up only to discover you are still dreaming, this becomes the metaphorical architecture upon which the theory stands. The psychological mechanism underlying this concept emerges from our fundamental inability to trust our own perception and our deep confusion about the nature of consciousness itself. For if our minds can so convincingly construct an entire world that feels absolutely real while we sleep, What proof do we truly possess that this waking world is not similarly constructed by some greater mind dreaming us into existence? It taps into ancient religious and philosophical traditions that have long suggested reality is illusory, that the material world is a manifestation of something far more fundamental and spiritual, yet it clothes these ideas in the language of modern neuroscience and cosmology. What remains most striking about this theory is how it persists and evolves despite having no testable mechanism, no falsifiable hypothesis, and no empirical framework through which we could ever verify it. Yet people continue to ponder it earnestly, finding comfort perhaps in the notion that existence itself might be more fluid and dreamlike than our rational minds want to accept, and that somewhere in the depths of reality, something is dreaming us all into being. Consider the peculiar experience that many people report across cultures and centuries. The sensation of dreaming about someone at the precise moment that person is thinking of you, or receiving a phone call the morning after dreaming vividly about an old friend you haven't spoken to in years, or sensing that a loved one is in distress through the content of an unsettling dream, only to discover later that something indeed happened to them at that very time. These moments occur with enough frequency in human experience that they have spawned entire belief systems around the concept of dream telepathy, the theory that our sleeping minds possess the ability to transmit information, emotions, or premonitions to other conscious or unconscious minds across physical distance. People describe falling asleep while worried about someone and then experiencing a dream so vivid and emotionally intense that upon waking, they feel compelled to contact that person, only to learn that something significant occurred during the night that required help or understanding. The mechanism proposed by believers in this phenomenon suggests that during sleep, when the conscious mind relinquishes its usual filtering and logical gatekeeping, the brain becomes remarkably receptive to subtle forms of communication that might otherwise go unnoticed or be rationalized away by our waking analytical faculties. Some theorists propose that strong emotional bonds create energetic or quantum connections between individuals that allow dream states to facilitate the transmission of information, emotions, or even premonitions across the barrier of physical space, particularly between family members or deeply intimate relationships where the neural patterns have become entangled through years of shared experience. Yet despite the compelling anecdotal evidence and the psychological comfort such explanations provide, the scientific impossibility of such transmission remains stubbornly immutable. No mechanism in neuroscience can account for electrical impulses generated by one brain somehow reaching another brain without technological intermediaries, and controlled laboratory experiments have consistently failed to demonstrate dream telepathy under conditions that eliminate statistical coincidence. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have maintained for thousands of years a concept of reality that fundamentally challenges our Western understanding of time, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself, a worldview known as dreamtime or dreaming, which posits that the world we inhabit was shaped during an ancestral period when powerful spiritual beings emerged from the earth and sky, creating mountains, rivers, animals, and plants through their journeys across the land, and remarkably. This period is not considered to be merely historical or mythological in the way Western cultures typically compartmentalize such narratives, but rather it is understood as an ongoing, eternal dimension of reality that continues to exist alongside and interpenetrate with the present moment. In this framework, dreams are not simply the nocturnal firing of neurons or the processing of daily experiences, but rather they are direct encounters with this dreamtime realm, windows into a parallel layer of existence where the ancestral beings still move and act, where the fundamental laws that govern creation continue to operate, and where an individual's spirit can interact with the deep structures of reality itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system appears to stem from the remarkable vividness and sense of presence that dreams create, the way that dream experiences feel fundamentally different from waking thought, possessing their own logic and compelling internal consistency that makes them seem less like mere imagination and more like genuine access to another domain, combined with the cultural reinforcement of these interpretations across generations. The integration of dreams into spiritual practice and land navigation, and the ways in which certain dreams do seem to correlate with real events or provide practical knowledge that proves useful in Aboriginal societies. Consider the experience of falling asleep while dreaming, where you find yourself lying in bed in what feels like absolute reality, experiencing a fully formed dream environment complete with physics, logic, and narrative progression, only to awaken within that same dream to discover you were asleep all along, and then perhaps this cycle repeats itself multiple times before you actually wake to true consciousness, leaving you disoriented and uncertain about which layers of experience were genuine and which were fabrications of your sleeping mind. This phenomenon occurs with striking regularity in human experience, where the dreamer constructs an entire false awakening complete with bedroom surroundings, morning light filtering through windows, the sensation of standing and moving about the house, conversations with family members, and all the mundane details that convince the dreaming mind it has returned to waking life. The psychological mechanism behind this nested dreaming appears to involve the brain's remarkable ability to generate completely convincing false memories and sensory experiences, while simultaneously creating the meta-awareness that something is off, which then triggers another dream layer rather than actual awakening. The brain essentially dreams about dreaming, constructing recursive layers of consciousness, where each level contains the full apparatus of perception and belief in its own reality. And neuroscientific research suggests this occurs because the regions responsible for rational evaluation and reality testing never fully engage during REM sleep, allowing the dreaming mind to accept increasingly bizarre scenarios without recognizing their impossibility. What remains peculiar is how universally normalized this experience has become despite its profound strangeness, as people discuss false awakenings and nested dreams with the casualness of describing ordinary sleep experiences, almost as though the mind regularly fooling itself multiple times within a single night is an acceptable and unremarkable occurrence rather than evidence of how fragile our grasp on reality truly is. Yet perhaps this very ordinariness is precisely what makes the phenomenon so unsettling in retrospect. We accept our mind's capacity for self-deception so readily that we rarely pause to consider what it means that consciousness itself offers no reliable internal mechanism for distinguishing authentic experience from elaborate fiction, and that we trust our waking reality primarily through habit and consensus, rather than through any foolproof verification system our brains possess. Among the most emotionally charged and persistently reported phenomena in the landscape of human dreaming sits the concept of visitation dreams, those peculiar nocturnal experiences wherein individuals report encounters with deceased loved ones who appear to communicate with them from beyond the threshold of mortality itself. These dreams occupy a unique and almost universally documented space within human experience, transcending culture, geography, and religious belief systems, manifesting across indigenous populations in the Amazon, Buddhist communities in Southeast Asia, Christian denominations throughout Europe and the Americas, and secular societies in developed nations alike. The common narrative thread involves a dreamer finding themselves in a dreamscape where a departed parent, sibling, child, or close friend materializes before them with remarkable clarity and presence, often delivering messages of comfort, reassurance, or sometimes warning, before gradually fading away as consciousness begins to reassert itself. These encounters frequently feel qualitatively different from ordinary dreams to the person experiencing them, characterized by unusual vividness, emotional intensity, and a lingering sense of reality that persists long after waking, sometimes for years or even decades afterward. The psychological mechanism underlying these experiences involves the intersection of grief processing, the brain's natural tendency to construct familiar faces and voices from pattern recognition systems, and the activation of memory networks associated with the deceased individual during REM sleep cycles. When we experience profound loss, the neural pathways encoding our relationships with the departed person remain deeply etched within our neurological architecture. And during sleep, when our conscious mind relaxes its logical gatekeeping functions, these pathways can activate with surprising vividness and emotional authenticity. The brain essentially reconstructs these individuals from the vast database of memories and sensory information accumulated throughout our relationships with them, creating something that feels subjectively indistinguishable from genuine contact, yet requires no external agent or paranormal mechanism to explain. What remains remarkable is how deeply we continue to give credence to these experiences despite understanding their psychological origins. How millions of people maintain the conviction that their departed loved ones intentionally visited them during sleep despite having no empirical mechanism by which such visitation could occur. Consider the experience of spending an entire day studying a particular concept, learning its intricacies, memorizing its details, and fully immersing yourself in its specific context, only to find that when you encounter a slightly different version of that same concept in a new environment or framed in an unfamiliar way, your mind struggles to recognize it or apply what you learned. This phenomenon, known colloquially as overfitting the brain, occurs when our neural pathways become so specifically tuned to the exact conditions under which we learned something that we lose the ability to generalize or transfer that knowledge to novel situations that require flexible thinking. It is as though your brain has essentially memorized the answer to one particular question so thoroughly that it cannot recognize when a fundamentally similar question is being asked with only minor variations in context or presentation. The mechanism underlying this strange cognitive limitation relates to how our brains optimize for efficiency through pattern recognition and neural pathway strengthening. When you repeatedly encounter the same information in the same format, your brain carves out increasingly efficient neural routes specifically designed for that exact pattern. But these highly specialized pathways do not automatically branch outward to handle unexpected variations or novel applications of the underlying principle. It is similar to how a machine learning algorithm can memorize training data perfectly while completely failing to generalize to new test cases, because it has learned the specific noise and quirks of the training set rather than the fundamental pattern beneath it. Your brain, in its infinite efficiency, does precisely this same thing, optimizing so completely for the narrow context you have repeatedly encountered that it essentially loses sight of the broader concept that should theoretically be portable across contexts. What makes this phenomenon particularly bizarre and worth contemplating during the drift towards sleep is how pervasive this overfitting remains in human experience despite our intellectual understanding that it happens and our ability to recognize it after the fact. Students can study intensely for a test, perform perfectly on questions identical to practice problems, yet freeze completely when faced with a genuinely novel application requiring the same skills, and somehow this cycle continues semester after semester without truly diminishing in frequency or impact. Imagine waking in the middle of the night in a state of complete paralysis, your body immobilized against your will, and in the darkness beside your bed, you sense a presence, a weight upon your chest, sometimes described as a shadowy figure or a demonic entity pressing down upon you with unmistakable sexual intent. And this experience has been reported consistently across cultures and centuries, from medieval European monasteries to contemporary bedrooms in Tokyo and Sao Paulo. With sufferers describing an overwhelming sense of dread, an inability to cry out, and the sensation of an invisible or visible creature engaging in non-consensual acts while they remain trapped in their own bodies, completely helpless. The incubus, traditionally conceived as a male demon, and the succubus, its female counterpart, have haunted the collective nightmare imagination of humanity for millennia, appearing in texts and testimonies with enough consistency that entire theological frameworks were constructed to explain them, and medieval religious scholars wrote extensively about the mechanisms by which these creatures operated, debating whether they were truly demons or merely manifestations of spiritual weakness in the dreamer's soul. The psychological explanation for these experiences lies in a phenomenon called sleep paralysis combined with hypnagogic hallucinations, which occurs during the transition between sleep stages when the brain becomes partially conscious while the body remains locked in the muscular atonia necessary for safe dreaming, creating a state where the conscious mind perceives threats and presences while simultaneously being unable to move or respond, and the brain, desperate to make sense of the sensations it is receiving, constructs elaborate narratives around the pressure on the chest and the feelings of presence, often sexualizing them because the paralysis affects the same neural pathways involved in arousal and physical sensation. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein you spend an entire day absorbing information, encountering new experiences, processing countless details and sensations, yet when you close your eyes at night, much of what transpired seems to slip away into the fog of forgetting, only to mysteriously reappear in your conscious mind days or weeks later with startling clarity and precision. This is the essence of memory consolidation, a process so fundamental to human cognition that we rarely pause to consider how genuinely strange it is that our brains require unconsciousness to properly file away the experiences of consciousness itself. The theory suggests that during sleep, particularly during the rapid eye movement stages when our most vivid dreams occur, the brain engages in an elaborate filing system, moving information from short-term holding areas into long-term storage vaults, reorganizing neural connections, and somehow determining which memories deserve preservation and which should be discarded entirely. What makes this process truly remarkable is that it happens entirely outside your awareness, without any conscious effort or intention on your part, as if there exists within your sleeping mind a diligent librarian who works through the night, cataloging and cross-referencing all the day's experiences while you lie completely unconscious and have no way of monitoring or controlling this crucial operation. The mechanism appears to involve the hippocampus replaying the day's events to the neocortex, creating something like a slow-motion highlight reel that gradually integrates new information with existing knowledge structures, a process that somehow requires the strange hallucinatory narratives of dreaming as its necessary backdrop. Yet despite the centrality of sleep to memory formation, despite clear evidence that sleep deprivation catastrophically impairs learning and retention, we continue to treat sleep as optional, as time stolen from productivity, as something to minimize rather than as the essential cognitive maintenance that it demonstrably is. We have normalized the contradiction between knowing scientifically that our brains absolutely require sleep for memories to stick, and yet structuring our lives to obtain insufficient sleep, creating a quiet epidemic of walking amnesia, where people struggle to remember what they learned yesterday because they sacrifice the very neurological process that would have consolidated that learning into stable, retrievable knowledge. Imagine waking in the dead of night with a crushing weight pressed against your chest, unable to move your limbs, unable to cry out, and seeing a dark shadowy figure standing at the foot of your bed or sitting upon your body, a malevolent presence that seems to drain the very life force from your being, leaving you paralyzed with pure terror until the apparition fades and you regain control of your muscles once more. This phenomenon, known as Night Hag Syndrome or more clinically as sleep paralysis with hallucinations, has haunted human consciousness across virtually every culture and civilization throughout recorded history, manifesting in countless forms from the Old Hag of Germanic folklore to the succubus of medieval demonology to the nightmare demon of contemporary Asian traditions, each culture independently describing nearly identical experiences despite having no contact with one another. The mechanism underlying this bizarre experience lies in the disconnect between the brain's sleep stages, specifically in the transitional moments between rapid eye movement sleep and wakefulness, when your consciousness begins to stir but your body remains locked in the natural paralysis that protects you from acting out your dreams, creating a situation where your mind becomes aware while your voluntary muscles remain completely immobilized. During these moments of consciousness, your brain often generates vivid hallucinations, typically of a malevolent presence or an oppressive weight, drawing upon archetypal fears and the surrounding darkness to construct images of dread and danger, all while you are acutely aware that something is terribly wrong but cannot move or scream for help. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is how remarkably consistent the descriptions remain across humanity, suggesting that the experience taps into something fundamental about our neurological wiring rather than cultural transmission. Yet despite our modern understanding of sleep physiology and our ability to explain every aspect of the mechanism with neuroscience, the terror of the night hag persists undiminished. People continue to report the experience as distinctly supernatural, and the folklore surrounding these encounters remains as potent and belief-laden as it was centuries ago when we had no framework for understanding what was actually occurring in the brain. Throughout human history, individuals have reported experiencing dreams that seemingly predicted future events with startling accuracy, a phenomenon commonly referred to as prophetic dreaming, and these accounts persist across virtually every culture and civilization we have documentation for, from ancient Egypt where pharaohs consulted dream interpreters before making crucial military decisions, to modern times where ordinary people wake with a vivid sense of certainty that they have glimpsed something yet to come, and the compelling nature of these experiences lies partly in the selective memory and pattern recognition systems that our brains naturally employ. Because when we dream each night, we generate dozens of narratives, scenarios, and symbolic imagery, most of which we forget entirely upon waking. Yet the few dreams we do retain sometimes align coincidentally with events that occur in the following days or weeks, and this alignment feels too precise, too meaningful to be mere chance. So we remember that particular dream with crystalline clarity, while the hundreds of other dreams that did not correspond to future events simply fade away into the fog of forgotten sleep. The psychological mechanism underpinning this phenomenon involves several cognitive biases working in concert, particularly the confirmation bias that leads us to notice and emphasize the dreams that came true while entirely disregarding the vast majority that did not, combined with the human tendency toward apophenia, which is the drive to find meaningful patterns in random data even when no genuine connection exists. And our brains are extraordinarily skilled at retrofitting events into narrative structures, meaning that when something does occur after we have dreamed it, we unconsciously reshape our memory of the dream to fit the event more perfectly than it actually did, embellishing certain details and forgetting others until the correspondence seems almost inevitable in retrospect. Additionally, we must consider that many people experience anxiety about future events and unconsciously process potential outcomes during sleep, which means that dreams about common occurrences like encountering old friends, experiencing conflict, or receiving news are statistically likely to bear some resemblance to actual events simply through probability and the basic human experiences we all share. Yet when these ordinary coincidences happen to align with reality, the dreamer experiences a profound sense of having touched something beyond the normal bounds of perception and causality. Consider the peculiar threshold between wakefulness and sleep, that liminal space where your consciousness begins to dissolve yet hasn't fully surrendered to the dream state, and you find yourself experiencing a phenomenon that neuroscience calls hypnagogia, a state so common and yet so bizarrely unexplained that most people encounter it regularly without ever naming what they're experiencing. During this transitional period, which typically lasts anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, your brain appears to operate under entirely different rules than it does during either pure wakefulness or established sleep, generating what can only be described as hallucinations that feel utterly real in the moment, yet vanish instantly upon full awakening, leaving behind only the faint memory of their existence. You might see geometric patterns fractal in nature and shifting in impossible ways, or witness shadowy figures moving at the periphery of your vision, or hear voices speaking words in languages you don't recognize, or experience the sensation of falling through infinite space, even though your body remains completely still in bed. The hypnagogic state produces what researchers believe is a unique neurological condition where your visual cortex continues to generate imagery while your logical reasoning centers are offline, meaning your brain manufactures these experiences with absolute conviction but possesses no mechanism to question or contextualize them. This occurs because as you drift toward sleep, your brain gradually reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for critical thinking and reality testing, while simultaneously maintaining or even increasing activity in regions associated with visual processing and emotional response, creating a perfect storm for hallucination. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to involve the breakdown of normal sensory gating, the brain's usual filtering system that prevents random neural noise from being interpreted as genuine stimuli, so that during hypnagogia your brain treats its own spontaneous activity as if it were incoming sensory information demanding conscious attention. What makes hypnagogia particularly strange is how persistently it occurs across human populations despite offering no evolutionary advantage and causing no lasting harm, suggesting that this state is simply an unavoidable byproduct of how our consciousness powers down, an inherent glitch in the transition between two fundamentally different modes of brain operation. Consider the experience of drifting toward sleep, that peculiar threshold between wakefulness and unconsciousness where your body begins to relax and your defenses lower, and yet something within you remains alert, almost vigilant, as though some internal guardian refuses to fully surrender to the vulnerability of sleep. The Sentinel Hypothesis proposes that this phenomenon represents an evolutionary remnant, a neurological watchdog that persists in human consciousness even in our modern, relatively safe environments, ensuring that some portion of our awareness continues to monitor our surroundings for threats even as we lose the ability to consciously perceive them. This sentinel function supposedly operates through a specialized neural mechanism where in certain areas of the brain, particularly those associated with threat detection and arousal, maintain a baseline level of activation throughout sleep, continuously scanning the acoustic and environmental landscape for danger signals that might require immediate awakening. The hypothesis suggests that this guardian consciousness explains why sudden noises or unexpected movements jolt us awake instantly, why we can sleep through familiar sounds yet wake at unfamiliar ones, and why we often experience that hypnagogic sensation of falling or of being watched just as we enter sleep's domain, the sentinel alerting us to ensure our defenses are still operational before releasing full control to sleep's deeper processes. The mechanism appears to involve the reticular activating system, that ancient brainstem structure responsible for maintaining consciousness and vigilance, which seems to partition itself during sleep rather than shutting down completely, allowing the conscious mind to rest while delegating security operations to an unconscious observer. Yet what becomes peculiar is how this once essential survival mechanism persists with such intensity in modern humans living in climate-controlled homes with locked doors and alarm systems, in safe neighborhoods with police protection, where the actual threat level has diminished dramatically compared to our ancestral environments where genuine predators and hostile tribes posed constant dangers. We have essentially normalized this internal vigilance, accepting the sentinel's continued insistence on remaining partially awake as a natural component of sleep, rather than recognizing it as an outdated defensive strategy that no longer serves its original purpose, a ghost of ancient fears that still haunts the doorway between consciousness and sleep. Dream incubation is the practice of deliberately planting a specific thought, question, or intention into your mind before sleep, with the conscious expectation that your dreams will address, explore, or solve whatever occupies your waking concern. And this technique has been documented across cultures and centuries as a method to harness the sleeping mind's creative and problem-solving potential. Practitioners of dream incubation typically follow a ritualistic sequence that begins hours before bedtime, during which they might write down the problem they wish to explore, repeat it aloud several times, visualize themselves dreaming about it, or even speak directly to their future dreams as though making a formal request to their unconscious mind. The night before an important decision, creative professionals have reported incubating dreams about artistic direction. Scientists have attempted to dream their way toward theoretical breakthroughs, and ordinary people facing emotional dilemmas have deliberately seeded their minds with relationship questions, career anxieties, or personal mysteries they hope their sleeping consciousness will illuminate from unexpected angles. The mechanism appears to involve the way focused attention creates neural pathways and primes the brain's associative networks, so that when the mind enters the loosely organized state of REM sleep, these prepared themes naturally become woven into the dream narrative fabric because the brain's semantic networks have been activated and sensitized to notice connections related to the incubated topic. During sleep, without the rigid logical constraints of waking thought, the dreaming mind can forge unusual associations, retrieve forgotten memories, and synthesize disparate ideas in ways that sometimes produce genuine insights or creative solutions, which explains why people awaken with sudden clarity about problems they went to bed pondering. Yet despite the documented cases of successful dream incubation leading to real breakthroughs and the genuine neurological basis for why priming the mind should theoretically enhance dream relevance, most attempts at dream incubation fail to produce any noticeable effect. People forget their dreams entirely upon waking regardless of how carefully they incubated them, or they remember dreams that seem utterly unrelated to their stated intention. Consider the experience of falling asleep and finding yourself aware within a dream that feels remarkably consistent, with physics that mostly obeys certain rules, with characters who seem to possess their own agency and knowledge, and with environments that contain an almost algorithmic quality to their construction, as though they were generated rather than remembered. And then consider how this mirrors a persistent philosophical anxiety that has haunted human consciousness since the dawn of technological advancement, namely the question of whether our waking reality itself might be nothing more than an elaborate simulation being run by some higher intelligence or computational system existing on a plane we cannot perceive. And this theory suggests that dreams represent moments when the underlying architecture of consciousness becomes briefly visible. When the seams of our simulated reality crack open just enough to reveal the constructed nature of our existence. The mechanism operates on the principle that our brains, when freed from the constraints of waking logic and sensory input, default to processing information in ways that resemble how a simulation might generate experience, with certain shortcuts taken in rendering detail, with NPCs behaving according to loose scripts rather than genuine consciousness, with the rules of physics occasionally malfunctioning or contradicting themselves. And with our sense of self sometimes fragmenting or observing from impossible angles, suggesting that the normal waking state requires constant calibration and correction to maintain the illusion of a coherent reality, while dreams strip away these corrections and leave us face to face with the raw mechanics of how experience is actually constructed. What renders this theory particularly resistant to dismissal is that it offers a strange comfort, an explanation for the uncanny feeling many people experience upon waking, that peculiar sense that reality itself is somehow not entirely real, not entirely solid, a sensation that persists even as we engage with the tangible world, and the theory has found increasingly mainstream acceptance through science fiction narratives and philosophical discussions. To the point where the simulation hypothesis no longer feels like fringe thinking, but rather like a legitimate question worth entertaining, and perhaps this normalization itself serves as evidence for the theory, as though the simulation itself is gradually preparing us to accept the truth of our condition through the slow introduction of the idea into our collective consciousness. Out-of-body dreams represent one of the most persistent and universally reported phenomena in human sleep experience, wherein the dreamer perceives themselves as existing outside of their physical body, often floating above it or observing it from a distant vantage point, sometimes traveling through impossible landscapes or familiar spaces rendered entirely unrecognizable by the peculiar logic of the dream state. These experiences occur with remarkable frequency across cultures and time periods, with reports dating back centuries in religious texts, philosophical writings, and personal journals, suggesting that the sensation of consciousness separating from flesh is somehow deeply encoded within the human experience of sleep and dreaming. The person experiencing such a dream typically finds themselves suddenly aware that they are no longer bound by the limitations of their physical form, able to move through walls, fly at tremendous speeds, or simply hover motionless while observing the world from above, all while maintaining a sense of self and continuity of consciousness that feels entirely authentic and undeniable in the moment. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to involve a unique kind of neurological mismatch during REM sleep, where the brain's movement centers generate signals for motion while the body remains paralyzed, creating a profound disconnect between the sense of self and proprioceptive feedback from the physical body. Additionally, the brain during these dream states may activate regions associated with spatial awareness and perspective taking, while simultaneously deactivating the neural correlates that normally integrate bodily sensation with conscious awareness, essentially creating a situation where the mind constructs a sense of location and perspective entirely independent from where the body actually exists. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how persistently people cling to supernatural or spiritual explanations for out-of-body dreams despite having reasonable neurological frameworks to understand them, suggesting that the visceral quality of these experiences, their sense of absolute realness and authenticity, overrides our ability to accept purely materialist explanations. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein individuals report that they have successfully learned or mastered a skill, a language, or a complex body of knowledge exclusively through their dreams, only to discover upon waking that the information has vanished entirely from their conscious mind, leaving behind only the phantom sensation of competence and the vague emotional memory of having understood something profound. This theory proposes that dreams may function as a kind of inverted educational experience, where the brain constructs elaborate scenarios of learning and mastery that feel entirely authentic and complete while one sleeps, yet dissolve into nothingness the moment consciousness returns, as if the dream state operates according to an entirely separate epistemological system with its own logic and validity that simply cannot translate to waking cognition. The mechanism underlying this curious reversal suggests that during REM sleep, when the prefrontal cortex responsible for critical evaluation is significantly less active, the brain may generate simulations of learning processes that feel emotionally and sensorially complete, creating the convincing illusion of understanding without actually encoding any retrievable information into long-term memory structures that waking consciousness can access. The brain essentially tricks itself into experiencing the satisfaction of mastery, the emotional rewards of achievement, and the sense of expanded capability, all while producing no actual change in one's waking abilities or knowledge. What makes this phenomenon particularly striking is how persistently people report these experiences despite the universality of their failure upon waking, as if the brain continues to engage in this elaborate self-deception night after night, generating dreams of fluent conversations in languages one does not speak, dreams of solving complex mathematical proofs, dreams of playing musical instruments with virtuosic skill. All with such conviction that the dreamer awakens with genuine disappointment at the inevitable discovery that nothing has actually been learned at all. Perhaps most intriguingly, some neuroscientists speculate that this phenomenon represents not a malfunction but an evolutionary artifact, a vestigial rehearsal system wherein the sleeping brain practices the feeling asterisk of competence as a form of motivational priming, preparing the psyche for future waking attempts at genuine mastery, even if the specific dream content itself proves neurologically transient and cognitively inaccessible. Imagine spending several hours playing Tetris, that deceptively simple video game where colorful blocks fall from the top of the screen and you rotate them to fit into neat lines. And then when you finally close your eyes that night, you find yourself still seeing those falling blocks in the darkness of your mind, still mentally rotating them, still trying to fit them together into perfect formations even though you are no longer holding a controller and the game has ended. This phenomenon, which researchers have named the Tetris Effect, describes the strange persistence of visual and cognitive patterns in our minds after we have engaged in repetitive activities. And it occurs most notably after extended gameplay, but has been observed in countless other contexts including knitting, reading dense text, scrolling through social media feeds, or even driving long distances on highways. The experience typically involves seeing patterns from the activity overlaid onto the real world or appearing unbidden in the quiet moments before sleep, as though your brain has become so deeply attuned to recognizing and processing those particular shapes and sequences that it cannot simply switch off this mode of perception when you stop engaging with the activity itself. The psychological mechanism behind this effect operates through a process called involuntary mental imagery combined with priming and pattern recognition, wherein the repeated activation of certain neural pathways related to visual processing and spatial reasoning creates what neuroscientists describe as an attentional bias that persists even after the external stimulus has been removed. Your brain has essentially learned to see the world through the framework of the activity, and this learned perspective does not disappear the moment you stop participating in that activity, but instead continues firing along those same neural circuits as if searching for more of the same patterns to process and organize. What makes this effect particularly fascinating and somewhat unsettling is that despite our modern understanding of neuroscience and how the brain forms these temporary perceptual habits, we have come to accept the Tetris effect as merely a quirky curiosity of human cognition, rather than recognizing it as evidence of how thoroughly our brains can be rewired by even brief periods of intense focus and repetition. Consider the peculiar moment when you awaken from a dream and experience an overwhelming sense that you have dreamed this exact dream before, not once, but perhaps many times across the years of your sleeping life. And you lie there in the darkness trying to piece together whether this repetition actually occurred or whether your mind has simply manufactured the sensation of familiarity in the space between sleep and wakefulness. This phenomenon, known as Déjà Rêvé, represents a curious inversion of the more commonly discussed déjà vu, that strange feeling of having experienced a present moment before, and instead it concerns itself entirely with the realm of dreams, with the unsettling recognition that a nocturnal narrative feels achingly familiar even though you cannot quite locate it in your memory, cannot point to a specific night when you dreamed it previously. Yet remain convinced nonetheless that your sleeping mind has traveled this particular path before. The psychological mechanism underlying this experience likely involves the way your brain processes narrative patterns and emotional content during sleep, constructing dreams from a vast library of memories, anxieties, and creative recombinations that naturally tend to repeat certain themes and structures because the human mind gravitates toward familiar emotional landscapes and archetypal scenarios. So when you encounter a dream that incorporates several of these recurring elements simultaneously, your brain triggers a recognition response, even though the specific combination might be entirely novel. What makes Déjà Rêvé particularly intriguing is that it persists as a widespread experience despite our inability to actually verify whether we have dreamed something before. Since dreams are notoriously difficult to remember with any precision and fade rapidly upon waking, meaning that the sense of repetition might simply be your mind responding to the gestalt quality of a dream rather than to any actual precedent. Yet people continue to report this sensation with remarkable consistency, suggesting that we have developed an almost philosophical acceptance of this uncertainty, recognizing that our dreams operate in a realm where verification is impossible, and therefore familiarity and novelty become strangely interchangeable concepts that our sleeping consciousness navigates without requiring proof or logical resolution. Imagine waking up and immediately calling a friend or family member because you both experienced nearly identical dreams on the same night, despite living in separate locations with no communication between you, and both of you recall specific details that match in ways that seem far too precise to be coincidental or explained through normal probability. This phenomenon is what believers in mutual dreaming describe as a shared nocturnal experience, where two or more people simultaneously enter the dream space and interact with each other in ways that feel remarkably real and consistent across all participants involved. The people who report these experiences often describe meeting in familiar locations within their dreams, having conversations that feel substantive and purposeful, and waking with the distinct memory of having spent time with the other person, only to discover through conversation that the other person remembers the exact same encounter from their perspective. Some accounts describe mutual dreamers solving problems together in their shared dream state, working through emotional situations collaboratively, or simply spending time in idealized locations that neither person has consciously discussed beforehand, yet both describe in remarkable detail. The proposed mechanism behind this phenomenon suggests that consciousness itself may not be confined to individual brains during sleep, but rather that the dreaming mind enters some kind of collective mental space where barriers between separate individuals dissolve, allowing for genuine interaction and shared experience that transcends the normal constraints of physical separation. Some theories propose that strong emotional bonds create resonance patterns between people that facilitate this crossing, while others suggest that the sleeping brain becomes more receptive to receiving and transmitting subtle forms of communication that waking consciousness naturally filters out. What makes mutual dreaming particularly fascinating is how it persists within our cultural consciousness despite the complete absence of measurable, reproducible scientific evidence. The psychological explanations that suggest false memory creation and confirmation bias, and the logical impossibility it presents when confronted with everything we understand about neurology and the nature of consciousness. Yet people continue reporting these experiences with genuine conviction, and the stories persist through generations, adapted and retold within families as evidence of deep connection and special bonds between loved ones. Consider for a moment the peculiar experience of waking from a vivid dream in which you were absolutely convinced of the reality surrounding you, where the logic seemed sound and the sensations felt genuine, and yet upon waking you realized that none of it actually occurred in the way you experienced it, that your sleeping mind had constructed an entire world complete with physics and people and consequences that evaporated the moment consciousness shifted. Now imagine applying this exact phenomenon to your waking life, to this very moment as you lie in bed listening to these words, where the possibility emerges that what you are experiencing right now is itself a dream from which you have not yet awakened, that the continuity you perceive and the sense of linear time you experience could be the elaborate construction of a sleeping consciousness that has not yet noticed its own dreaming state. The mechanism behind this theory rests on a fundamental observation about the nature of consciousness itself, which is that the brain generates subjective experience through neural activity, whether that activity is triggered by external sensory input during waking hours or by internal patterns firing during sleep. And since consciousness cannot directly verify the source of its own stimuli, it remains theoretically impossible to definitively prove from within the experience that what you perceive is real, rather than a construct of neural firing. Throughout human history, this idea has persisted in various forms across cultures and philosophical traditions, from ancient Hindu concepts of Maya suggesting that material reality is illusion, to modern thought experiments like Descartes' evil demon or the contemporary simulation hypothesis. And yet, despite the logical coherence of this uncertainty, and despite the fact that no absolute proof can ever be generated from within any subjective experience, we have somehow normalized the assumption that our waking reality must be fundamentally different from dreams, that consciousness operates under different rules when our eyes are open, that the stability and consistency of waking perception provides sufficient evidence of its objective truth, when in reality these qualities might simply reflect the particular way a brain constructs experience in different states rather than providing proof of external reality. Consider the peculiar experience of waking up in the morning with a vivid memory of having walked through an entire landscape, navigated complex spaces, climbed stairs, crossed bridges, and moved your legs repeatedly throughout the night, all while your body remained completely motionless in bed, frozen by the neurological process we call sleep paralysis or muscle atonia that prevents us from acting out our dreams. This phenomenon, which we might call dream walking, represents one of the most disorienting contradictions in human consciousness, where the sensory experience of locomotion is so convincing that upon waking we often check our feet to see if they are truly intact, so real was the sensation of movement through space. The experience typically involves not merely the imagined concept of walking, but the full sensory recreation of muscular effort, the proprioceptive feedback of balance and weight distribution, the visual experience of ground passing beneath us, and sometimes even the felt sensation of fatigue or exertion in legs that have not moved at all. The mechanism underlying dream walking appears to involve the brain's remarkable capacity to generate complete motor simulations during REM sleep, when the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex becomes less active while the limbic system and visual cortex remain highly engaged, essentially allowing the brain to execute motor commands that never reach the muscles because the spinal cord has been chemically silenced by neurotransmitter suppression. This creates a dissociation where our motor cortex genuinely fires as though commanding movement, our inner ear and balance systems receive vestibular signals as though responding to actual motion, and our visual and spatial processing systems interpret landscape and distance as though we are truly traversing it, yet the muscles themselves remain slack and unresponsive, creating a perfect illusion of movement without motion. What makes dream walking particularly strange is how persistently convincing it remains despite the fundamental impossibility of the experience, how we have simply accepted as normal this nightly occurrence where our consciousness is thoroughly deceived about our physical state, and how we rarely question the strangeness of waking each day with phantom memories of movements our bodies never made, of distances our legs never covered, of the accumulated impossibility of having walked thousands of miles while resting in a single position, a contradiction so profound that it suggests consciousness itself may be far less tethered to physical reality than we typically assume. Consider the peculiar figure known as the Sandman, a character that has persisted across cultures and centuries, appearing in bedtime stories told to countless children who struggle to fall asleep, a mysterious entity said to sprinkle magical sand into the eyes of the weary to guide them gently into slumber. This figure emerges with remarkable consistency in folklore from Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and beyond, always performing essentially the same function, always depicted as a benevolent presence who facilitates the transition from wakefulness to dreams through some unexplained supernatural mechanism involving granular matter and ocular contact. The Sandman represents humanity's attempt to personify and explain the physical sensation of tiredness that accumulates in our eyes as the day progresses, that peculiar grittiness and heaviness we feel during evening hours when our bodies signal their need for rest through the accumulation of actual biological debris and the natural drying of the tear film. When we experience that sensation, when we rub our eyes and feel that sandy texture, we are actually feeling the consequence of our own physiology, the normal process of our bodies winding down, yet instead of understanding it as a straightforward biological function, cultures across the world have constructed an elaborate mythological framework around it, populating the space with an imaginary being whose sole purpose is to visit us during vulnerable moments. The psychological mechanism behind this personification likely stems from our fundamental need to make sense of bodily sensations through narrative and character, transforming an impersonal biological process into an interaction with a friendly presence, which paradoxically makes the sensation feel less alienating and strange. By giving the sensation a name, a face, and benevolent intentions, we domesticate what might otherwise feel like an invasion of our senses, converting the sandiness in our eyes into evidence of a kindly visitor rather than mere physical deterioration. What remains remarkable is how this figure has survived into modern times despite our sophisticated understanding of sleep physiology, our knowledge of melatonin and circadian rhythms, and rapid eye movement cycles. Yet the Sandman persists in children's literature and cultural memory, suggesting that we still find comfort in the mythological explanation even when we consciously reject it. Consider the peculiar phenomenon where your dreams seem to contain sequences that follow no logical pattern whatsoever, where your mind strings together images and scenarios that would never occur to you in waking life, where you find yourself in a location that is somehow both your childhood home and a shopping mall simultaneously, or where you suddenly possess the ability to breathe underwater despite knowing full well that humans cannot do this. And yet in the dream state you accept this impossibility without question or alarm. This happens to nearly everyone who dreams, and neuroscientists have proposed a theory that suggests these bizarre, disconnected dream sequences might simply be the result of random neural noise, essentially your brain firing neurons in patterns that have no meaningful connection to memory, emotion, or logical thought processes. During rapid eye movement sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, your brain enters a state of heightened neural activity, yet the systems responsible for logical reasoning and executive function become largely offline, which means your visual cortex, emotional centers, and memory regions are all activating in somewhat chaotic and unpredictable ways, creating what could be described as neural static or white noise translated into the language of imagery and sensation. Your brain, in this state, essentially attempts to construct a narrative out of these random firings, weaving together whatever neural patterns happen to activate simultaneously into something that resembles a story, however nonsensical that story might ultimately be. The reason this theory persists is that it explains many features of dreams that have long puzzled researchers. The sudden scene changes, the emotional whiplash, the acceptance of impossible physics, the way dream logic operates on entirely different rules than waking logic. Your conscious mind, which would normally reject these contradictions and inconsistencies, is temporarily suppressed, so it cannot apply its usual editing or filtering mechanisms to question what is happening. What makes this theory particularly intriguing is how it suggests that dreams might not mean anything at all, that they might not be messages from our unconscious, that they might contain no hidden psychological significance, and yet we remain convinced that they matter, that they symbolize something, that they reveal truths about ourselves, demonstrating how deeply we resist the notion that sometimes our minds simply produce noise, and how readily we construct meaning from randomness. Consider the peculiar phenomenon in which our dreams appear to function as emotional processing centers, where the psyche systematically works through accumulated feelings, anxieties, and psychological tensions that have accumulated throughout our waking hours. And this theory suggests that dreams serve as a kind of nocturnal emotional gymnasium where suppressed frustrations, unresolved conflicts, and overwhelming feelings are brought to the surface in symbolic or direct form so that we might experience catharsis and return to waking consciousness with a diminished emotional burden. When you experience a particularly vivid nightmare involving confrontation or loss, the theory proposes that your mind is essentially rehearsing emotional responses and processing the weight of difficult situations in a controlled environment where the consequences remain purely psychological rather than tangible. The mechanism behind this curious function suggests that during rapid eye movement sleep, when dreams are most vivid and emotionally charged, the brain's rational prefrontal cortex becomes less active while the limbic system, which governs emotional processing, becomes hyperactive, thereby allowing emotions to be felt intensely without the logical constraints that normally govern our daytime behavior and decision-making processes. This neurological arrangement would permit the mind to experience the full spectrum of emotional intensity without external consequences, and the experience of these emotions in dream form supposedly leaves us emotionally lighter upon waking, as if the psychological burden has been distributed or processed through symbolic reenactment. What remains genuinely perplexing is how we have collectively accepted this theory as explanatory, despite the fact that many people report feeling exhausted rather than refreshed after emotionally intense dreams, and despite the recognition that traumatic nightmares often fail to provide emotional resolution and instead reinforce psychological distress and anxiety rather than diminishing it. Yet we continue to normalize the idea that dreams are somehow intrinsically beneficial for our emotional well-being without substantial questioning of why a supposedly adaptive mechanism would sometimes cause us greater psychological harm. In the quiet depths of night, somewhere between the waking world and the realm of sleep, a peculiar phenomenon occurs that has terrorized humans across centuries and cultures with remarkable consistency. A person lies in bed, fully aware of their surroundings, acutely conscious of the darkness pressing in around them, yet completely paralyzed from the neck down. Their eyes dart frantically in the darkness as a crushing weight settles upon their chest, and in many cases, a malevolent figure materializes at the foot of the bed or standing in the corner of the room, a shadowy presence that radiates pure dread. This is the Old Hag Syndrome, a condition so widespread that it appears in medieval European folklore as the nightmare demon, in Japanese culture as the kanashibari, and in African traditions as various spirits of oppression. The experience typically lasts only a few seconds to a few minutes, though to the sufferer it feels like an eternity of absolute helplessness and terror. What makes this phenomenon so deeply unsettling is that the person experiencing it maintains consciousness throughout, aware that something is profoundly wrong, yet unable to move or cry out for help. The mechanism behind this bizarre occurrence lies in the natural physiology of sleep itself. During the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, when our most vivid dreams occur, the brain wisely paralyses our voluntary muscles to prevent us from acting out our dreams and flailing about in bed. Occasionally, the brain awakens from this stage before the paralysis fully releases, creating a state called sleep paralysis. In this disorienting window, consciousness returns while the body remains locked in its nocturnal immobility. The brain, desperate to make sense of this terrifying situation and operating on partial information while still somewhat dream-influenced, begins to fabricate explanations for the paralysis and the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanies it. It generates a presence, a threat, a reason for the fear and the weight pressing down upon the chest, which is merely the result of the brain's misinterpreted signals from the paralyzed respiratory muscles. What remains profoundly strange is how this theory, despite being scientifically established and widely disseminated through modern medicine and psychology, has not eliminated the phenomenon's power to terrify. People continue to experience Old Hag Syndrome with the same visceral horror their ancestors felt centuries ago, knowing the explanation yet remaining unable to convince themselves during the experience that what they are witnessing is merely a glitch in the sleep mechanism. Consider the strange experience of waking from a dream in which you were certain that something terrible was about to happen, your heart racing, your body tense, only to realize moments later that nothing was actually wrong and that you were simply lying safely in your bed. Yet the emotional residue of the dream lingered for minutes or even hours afterward, coloring your initial waking moments with an inexplicable dread that seemed disproportionate to your actual circumstances. This phenomenon relates to what neuroscientists call predictive processing, a theory suggesting that our brains are fundamentally prediction machines constantly generating expectations about what will happen next based on patterns from past experience, and that dreams may represent the brain's way of testing these predictions in a safe environment, running simulations of potential futures and threats so that when we encounter similar situations in waking life, we are already partially prepared for them. The mechanism underlying this process involves the brain constructing elaborate models of reality by comparing incoming sensory information against predictions it has already made, and when there is a mismatch between what was predicted and what actually occurs, this generates an error signal that causes the brain to update its models and refine its future predictions, becoming more accurate over time. What makes this theory particularly compelling is the idea that dreams might serve as a kind of prediction rehearsal space, where the brain can test its models against imagined scenarios without the actual risks involved, allowing us to emotionally and cognitively prepare for dangers and challenges that might occur in our waking lives. And this would explain why dreams often feel so emotionally vivid and consequential, even when their content is completely fantastical or impossible. Yet despite the logical elegance of this explanation, we continue to find ourselves startled awake by nightmares, our bodies flooded with adrenaline, reacting to imaginary threats as though they were genuinely present, suggesting that our brains cannot easily distinguish between simulated danger and real danger, that the predictive machinery runs continuously and automatically regardless of whether we consciously understand what is happening or not. And this gap between our intellectual understanding of dreams as harmless brain simulations and our visceral, emotional reactions to them remains one of the most persistent puzzles of human consciousness. Consider the peculiar experience of waking from a dream and finding that the dream world felt entirely coherent while you were immersed within it. Yet the moment consciousness returns, the entire narrative structure begins to dissolve like morning mist. The continuity hypothesis suggests that our dreams are not the fragmented, illogical experiences we typically believe them to be, but rather continuous and meaningful narratives that only appear chaotic and nonsensical when we attempt to examine them through the lens of waking logic and rational scrutiny. According to this theory, dreams possess their own internal consistency, their own rules of causality and physics, their own emotional and symbolic logic that operates seamlessly while we sleep, making perfect sense within the context of that particular dream world, even if that world contains impossible architecture or people who are simultaneously themselves and other people at the same time. The mechanism behind this hypothesis rests on the understanding that during REM sleep, the prefrontal cortex, which governs our logical reasoning and reality testing, enters a state of reduced activity and metabolic function, while the limbic system and association cortices remain highly active and engaged. This neurological configuration allows the dreaming mind to accept premises and situations that the waking mind would immediately recognize as impossible or contradictory, creating what researchers describe as a form of altered consciousness where narrative continuity exists but operates under different parameters than waking consciousness. The dream mind constructs elaborate stories with fluid logic, where transitions that would seem jarring or nonsensical in waking life feel natural and inevitable, where the physics of the dream world are simply accepted as the baseline reality of that moment, yet we struggle to remember this continuity once we wake, because our waking brain must translate dream experience into the language and structure of waking consciousness. A process that necessarily distorts and fragments what was originally a coherent experience. What persists despite lacking logical foundation is our stubborn insistence that dreams are meaningless noise rather than recognizing them as alternative forms of consciousness operating under genuinely different rules. And we have normalized this dismissive attitude so thoroughly that we rarely pause to consider that perhaps we are misunderstanding the very nature of what dreams are meant to be rather than accepting that they are somehow deficient versions of waking thought. Consider the peculiar experience of encountering other people within your dreams, those secondary characters who populate the dreamscape alongside your own consciousness, and notice how consistently they behave in ways that feel simultaneously authentic and strangely hollow, as though they are following invisible scripts written specifically for the moment of your dreaming. You speak to your childhood friend, and they respond with familiarity, yet something in their replies seems predetermined, as though they are reciting lines rather than genuinely engaging with you, and this uncanny quality persists even as you experience the dream with complete conviction that these interactions are real. These dream characters, sometimes called non-player characters or NPCs by those who reference video game terminology, exhibit a remarkable consistency in their tendency to confirm whatever narrative your dreaming mind has constructed for them, agreeing with your premises without resistance, offering information you somehow already possess, and behaving in ways that serve your dreamscape's internal logic rather than pursuing independent agendas. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon emerges from the fundamental architecture of dreaming itself, wherein your own brain generates every component of the experience, including the dialogue, expressions, and behaviors of every single person who appears before you, meaning that these characters cannot truly surprise you because they are literal projections of your own neural activity. Your dreaming mind creates what appears to be another consciousness, complete with apparent intentions and knowledge, yet this consciousness is constructed entirely from your own memories, expectations, and assumptions about how that person would behave, resulting in characters that feel real but operate according to your subconscious understanding of their nature rather than their actual autonomy. What proves remarkable, and perhaps worthy of contemplation, is how readily we accept this strange duality while sleeping, experiencing these hollow beings as genuine others despite the absolute fact that we ourselves have assembled them from neural firing patterns. And we continue to do this night after night, without pausing to contemplate the philosophical implications of conversing with entities that are simultaneously real experiences and complete fabrications. Suggesting that our waking skepticism about the reality of dream interactions dissolves entirely once consciousness enters the sleeping state. Consider the peculiar experience of entering a dream where what feels like hours of narrative, conversation, and event actually occurs within the span of mere minutes of clock time, a phenomenon so consistently reported across cultures and centuries that it has become almost expected rather than questioned. And yet the mechanism by which our sleeping minds can compress or expand temporal perception remains one of the most bewildering aspects of dream consciousness that we continue to grapple with. In waking life, we experience time as a relatively linear progression marked by external stimuli, heartbeats, and environmental changes. But within the dream state, this external scaffolding dissolves entirely, leaving only the internal narrative of the mind to serve as the measure of duration. The sleeping brain, no longer synchronized with the constant input of sensory information that anchors us to clock time, appears capable of generating elaborate scenarios with apparent depth and detail that would logically require far more subjective time than the actual sleep period allows. Yet somehow this compression occurs without our conscious awareness of the discrepancy. One explanation rooted in neuroscience suggests that during REM sleep, when most vivid dreams occur, the brain's parietal regions which process temporal sequencing become less active, while the limbic system and visual cortex remain highly engaged, creating an environment where the normal temporal markers that organize our perception of duration are essentially offline, allowing the mind to string together experiences in a way that feels seamless despite lacking the neurological infrastructure that would normally measure time's passage. The brain may be processing information at different speeds during dreaming, or it may be generating memories of events that feel as though they took longer to unfold than they actually did, a kind of retrospective time expansion where the dream's subjective duration is constructed only after the dream concludes, existing primarily in memory rather than in any real-time experience. Yet despite our growing understanding of the neuroscience involved, the phenomenon persists in remaining somehow uncanny and difficult to fully reconcile with our waking understanding of how consciousness ought to operate. And we have largely normalized this strange temporal flexibility as simply one of many weird quirks of sleep, rather than pausing to consider how fundamentally strange it truly is that our minds can so thoroughly decouple from objective time. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of waking from a vivid dream only to find that your emotional response to the dream persists for hours afterward, long after your conscious mind has recognized the dream as unreal and forgotten its specific details. And this delayed emotional aftermath is what researchers and sleep theorists have come to call the dream lag effect, a fascinating quirk of human neurology in which the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain that processes feelings and creates emotional memories, continues to process and reinforce the emotional content of a dream well after the rational prefrontal cortex has dismissed the dream narrative as mere fiction. During rapid eye movement sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, the brain generates intense emotional and sensory experiences through the activation of the amygdala and other emotional centers, while simultaneously suppressing the neural regions responsible for logic and critical thinking, which means that during the dream itself, your emotional response is completely genuine, and your brain treats the dream experience with the same neurochemical intensity it would apply to a real-world event. When you wake, your rational mind quickly recognizes that the dream was not real, yet the emotional imprint has already been burned into your neurochemistry through the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, and the formation of emotional memory pathways that take considerably longer to dissolve than the time it takes for conscious recall of the dream to fade. Thus you find yourself anxious, melancholic, elated, or disturbed throughout your morning, puzzled by the lingering emotional weight of a dream you can barely remember, your body and emotional mind operating on a delay relative to your conscious understanding of reality. What makes this effect particularly strange is how normalized it has become despite its fundamental illogic, as we have collectively accepted that dreams possess a kind of emotional authority that transcends their unreality, treating them as meaningful precisely because they affected us, rather than questioning why our neurochemistry insists on honoring the emotional truth of events we know never happened. Consider the experience of spending an entire afternoon absorbed in a particular activity, perhaps painting a wall in your home, and then finding yourself in the landscape of sleep, still engaged in the repetitive motion of brushstrokes across an imaginary surface, or the texture of the paint roller moving beneath your hands in ways that defy the laws of physics, transforming the mundane labor into something simultaneously familiar and utterly strange. This phenomenon, known as day residue, represents one of the most straightforward, yet profoundly overlooked aspects of dream content, and yet it remains one of the most significant bridges between our waking world and the elaborate narratives that unfold when we close our eyes. The mechanism underlying day residue emerges from the brain's fundamental need to process and consolidate the information it has encountered during waking hours, particularly sensory experiences and emotional engagements that have occupied our attention for extended periods. And when sleep arrives, these recent memories and impressions do not simply vanish into some cognitive void, but instead become the raw material from which our dreams are constructed. The psychological explanation suggests that the hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped structure deep within the brain responsible for memory formation, works during sleep to transfer information from short-term storage into long-term memory, and this process naturally incorporates the most salient and recently encountered material into the dream narrative as a kind of cognitive housekeeping. What renders day residue particularly fascinating is how ubiquitous and persistent it remains despite our modern understanding of dream mechanics. For we continue to find ourselves dreaming about our work, our worries, the movies we watched, or the conversations we had mere hours before sleep. Yet we rarely question why this happens or acknowledge it as the ordinary neurological process that it fundamentally is. The phenomenon suggests that our dreams are not entirely the exotic productions of the unconscious mind that early psychoanalytic theory proposed, but rather they are substantially composed of the ordinary detritus of daily life, the fragments and pieces of experience that our brains automatically incorporate into the dreamscape, creating the peculiar hybrid experiences where yesterday's events become tonight's surreal narratives. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that visits the sleeping mind with remarkable regularity, a dream so persistent that it returns night after night, sometimes across months or even years, creating a strange loop of narrative that our unconscious seems determined to replay regardless of how many times we have experienced it. These recurring dreams manifest in countless forms, from the familiar anxiety dream where you arrive unprepared for an examination you forgot existed, to more elaborate scenarios involving childhood homes, deceased relatives, or impossible situations that defy the laws of physics and logic yet feel entirely credible within the dream state itself. The person experiencing these dreams often finds themselves acutely aware that they have encountered this exact sequence before, that they have walked down this particular hallway or faced this specific threat on numerous prior occasions. Yet the dream unfolds with the same emotional intensity and apparent novelty as if experiencing it for the very first time. Psychologically, these recurring dreams are theorized to emerge from unresolved psychological conflicts or persistent anxieties that the waking mind has not adequately processed, suggesting that the unconscious deliberately resurrects the same scenario repeatedly until the dreamer achieves some form of emotional or cognitive resolution with the underlying issue at stake. The dream essentially becomes a therapeutic mechanism, a nightly rehearsal of conflict and consequence that continues to loop, because the brain has not yet extracted the necessary lesson or achieved the necessary catharsis to allow the pattern to dissolve naturally. What makes this phenomenon particularly strange is that despite our consciousness being fully aware that we have dreamed this dream before, despite understanding on some level that the threat is imaginary or that the situation is a repetition, we continue to respond with genuine fear, genuine sadness, or genuine concern, as though our emotional systems and our rational understanding operate on completely separate timelines that never quite synchronize. Imagine finding yourself in a dream within a dream, where the space you occupy feels caught between states of being, neither fully formed nor completely dissolved, existing in that peculiar threshold where one reality begins to fade while another hasn't yet solidified into clarity. This is the phenomenon some researchers and dream enthusiasts have come to call liminal dreaming, a state in which the dreamer becomes aware they are navigating spaces that feel architecturally unstable, conceptually ambiguous, and temporally displaced from any recognizable waking geography. The hallways extend infinitely in directions that shouldn't connect, the rooms rearrange themselves with each turn, and the lighting exists in a perpetual state of either dawn or dusk, never quite committing to either brightness or darkness. These are not nightmares in the conventional sense, but rather disorienting journeys through spaces that trigger a peculiar form of unease, a recognition that something about the environment violates fundamental laws of spatial logic and permanence. The psychological mechanism underlying liminal dreaming appears connected to how our brains process memory consolidation and spatial awareness during sleep, particularly during the lighter stages of REM sleep, when the prefrontal cortex remains partially active while the rest of the brain cycles through dreamscape generation. During this state, our minds have access to architectural fragments from countless places we've visited, seen in photographs, or encountered in media, and these fragments reassemble themselves according to emotional associations rather than structural coherence. The liminal quality emerges because our brain is simultaneously trying to construct environments, while another part of it recognizes the impossibility of what's being created, resulting in an uncanny valley effect that exists entirely within the unconscious mind. What remains fascinating is how deeply this phenomenon resonates with contemporary culture despite being rarely discussed in mainstream sleep science, with thousands of people online describing nearly identical experiences of navigating empty hotel corridors, abandoned shopping malls, transitional airport terminals, and empty office buildings that somehow feel both familiar and profoundly wrong. This shared vocabulary for describing nearly universal dream experiences suggests something deeper about how human consciousness processes liminal spaces, those in-between places that exist primarily for transit rather than inhabitation, and how our sleeping minds become oddly fascinated with exploring their strange logic and impossible geometries. Consider the experience of waking abruptly in the dead of night, your heart racing violently against your ribs, your body drenched in perspiration despite the cool darkness of your bedroom, and most disturbingly, the overwhelming sensation that an invisible presence has been sitting upon your chest, pressing down with tremendous weight while you were paralyzed and unable to move or cry out for help. This phenomenon has been described across cultures for centuries under many names, most notably as the visitation of the mare, a creature from Germanic and Scandinavian folklore believed to be a malevolent spirit or demon that visits sleepers during the night and suffocates them with its presence, leaving them gasping and terrified as they struggle against an invisible force. The sufferer of this experience lies in bed unable to speak, unable to move any limb voluntarily, and yet acutely aware of their surroundings and the inexplicable terror that grips their mind, and many report seeing shadowy figures or demonic entities standing at the foot of their bed or sitting directly upon them, crushing the very breath from their lungs. The mechanism behind this bizarre phenomenon is now understood by modern neuroscience as sleep paralysis, a temporary disconnection between the conscious mind and the body's motor functions that occurs during the transition between sleeping and waking states, particularly during rapid eye movement sleep, when dreams are most vivid and intense. During these episodes, the brain remains aware and alert, while the body's voluntary muscles remain atonic, or essentially frozen, as a neurological safeguard to prevent a person from acting out their dreams and potentially causing harm to themselves or others during sleep. Simultaneously, the visual cortex and emotional centers of the brain may activate with fragments of dreams or hypnagogic hallucinations, creating the illusion of shadowy presences, demonic entities, or the sensation of tremendous weight upon the chest, all of which combine to create a deeply unsettling and terrifying experience that feels absolutely real to the afflicted person. Yet despite decades of neurological research explaining this phenomenon with clarity and precision, the folklore of the mare persists in our collective consciousness with remarkable tenacity, and people continue to describe their sleep paralysis episodes using the language of supernatural visitation rather than neurological explanation, suggesting that the human mind possesses a deep resistance to accepting physiological explanations for experiences that feel so profoundly otherworldly and invasive. Consider the peculiar notion that during sleep, your brain is not resting in the traditional sense, but rather engaging in an elaborate process of neurological housekeeping, systematically pruning away excess synaptic connections that have accumulated throughout your waking hours, a theory that suggests dreams themselves might be the subjective experience of this vast cellular reorganization occurring beneath the surface of consciousness. The Synaptic Homeostasis hypothesis proposes that during the day, as you learn, remember, and process information, your neurons form new synaptic connections and strengthen existing ones in response to experience, creating an ever-expanding network of neural pathways that becomes increasingly dense and metabolically demanding. According to this framework, Sleep serves as a biological necessity, not for rest in the conventional sense, but rather as a maintenance window during which the brain selectively weakens many of these connections, scaling them back to a baseline level in a process called synaptic downscaling, which prevents the neural network from becoming so overgrown and resource-intensive that it can no longer function efficiently. The theory suggests that while your conscious mind experiences dreams, your deeper brain structures are methodically reviewing the connections formed during waking life and deciding which ones are truly important enough to maintain, allowing the brain to reset itself for another day of learning while conserving energy and preventing a kind of neurological saturation. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is how it transforms the dream state from something mystical or purely psychological into a mechanistic maintenance operation. Yet despite the logical elegance of this explanation, we remain almost entirely unaware of this process occurring, and most people continue to view sleep as a period of simple unconsciousness rather than as an elaborate cellular reorganization event. The persistence of this view, even among those who understand the Synaptic Homeostasis hypothesis intellectually, suggests how deeply ingrained our assumptions about consciousness and rest remain, how we continue to experience dreams as narrative experiences rather than as the subjective sensation of neural pruning, and how the brain keeps its most fundamental maintenance procedures operating entirely outside the theater of our awareness. Among the most universally experienced dream phenomena exists the sensation of falling through space, a visceral and often jarring experience that jolts countless sleepers awake in the dead of night with their hearts racing and their bodies drenched in perspiration. The dreamer finds themselves suspended in an endless void, watching the ground or some distant surface rush upward with inexorable speed, and there is nothing to grasp, nothing to slow the descent, only the pure and undeniable certainty that impact is coming. The body tenses in anticipation of collision, muscles contract involuntarily, and frequently the sleeper awakens before the moment of contact, though some report dreams where the impact occurs and they survive it, only to find themselves falling again in an infinite loop of descent. The experience is remarkably consistent across cultures, across age groups, and across individuals who have never discussed such dreams with one another, suggesting something fundamental about the human experience of vulnerability and loss of control. Some dreamers describe the sensation as beginning peacefully, standing on a platform or cliff edge, before suddenly the ground gives way or their footing disappears, transforming security into terror in an instant. Others report a more gradual descent, where they initially don't realize they're falling until they look down and see the impossibility of their situation unfold beneath them. The mechanisms underlying these dreams have been theorized to relate directly to the neurology of sleep itself, particularly the way the brain processes vestibular information during different sleep stages. During REM sleep, the brain paralyzes the body to prevent physical movement during dreams, yet the inner ear and the neural pathways responsible for balance and spatial orientation remain partially active, creating a profound disconnect between what the mind perceives and what the body can do. The brain, confronted with this sensory contradiction, may construct narratives that incorporate this fundamental destabilization, and falling becomes a dream's way of expressing the peculiar vulnerability of being conscious yet immobilized. Additionally, muscle atonia, the temporary paralysis that accompanies REM sleep, can trigger what some researchers call hypnic jerks or sleep starts, involuntary muscle contractions that occur as the body transitions between wakefulness and sleep, and the dreaming mind may incorporate these physical sensations into narrative scenarios involving descent and loss of control. Consider the peculiar experience of falling asleep and finding yourself in a world that feels entirely real, where you interact with people who seem to possess their own thoughts and intentions, where conversations unfold naturally and strangers behave according to comprehensible social rules. Yet upon waking you realize with absolute certainty that every single element of that world was generated entirely by your own mind. You were not observing a pre-existing reality, you were not receiving transmissions from elsewhere, you were the sole architect of every detail, from the color of the sky to the precise inflection in a dream character's voice to their apparent emotional responses to your actions. This is the solipsistic dream, a nightly rehearsal of a philosophical nightmare that has troubled human consciousness for centuries. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon reveals something profoundly unsettling about the nature of consciousness and perception itself. When you dream, your brain operates in a state of profound neurochemical difference from wakefulness, with dramatically reduced activity in regions associated with critical evaluation and reality testing, while simultaneously maintaining full access to memory, emotional processing, and sensory simulation systems. Your mind constructs entire narratives, populates them with convincing characters, generates dialogue that sounds natural and responsive, and creates physical sensations of movement and touch, all while you remain in a stationary body, eyes closed, receiving no external sensory input whatsoever. The dream characters respond to your actions as if they possess independent agency, yet this is an illusion generated by your own predictive brain systems, which extrapolate their behavior based on social knowledge stored in your memory. What persists despite this complete logical absurdity is a strange acceptance, almost a normalization, of this solipsistic reality while the dream is occurring. You do not question it, you do not demand evidence of other minds, you do not apply philosophical skepticism to the world surrounding you, and you certainly do not recognize that you are trapped in a self-generated simulation of remarkable sophistication. Only upon waking, when different neurochemical conditions restore your capacity for reflection and critical thought, do you suddenly recognize the radical nature of what just occurred. You inhabited a universe containing only yourself as the genuine conscious entity, yet you did not know it. Consider the experience of drifting in and out of consciousness during those final moments before sleep fully claims you, or perhaps during the shallow stages of rest when your mind remains partially aware of the external world around you. And in these liminal spaces between wakefulness and true sleep, something peculiar occurs that researchers have come to call microdreams. These are the fragmented, often nonsensical dream sequences that flash through your mind in rapid succession, lasting only seconds or perhaps a handful of seconds at most, yet feeling somehow complete and emotionally coherent in their own strange way. You might find yourself suddenly aware of a vivid image, a conversation that makes perfect sense in the moment, or an entire scenario that feels entirely real, only to have it dissolve instantly the moment you try to grasp it or reflect upon it more carefully. The microdream differs fundamentally from the longer REM stage dreams that dominate our sleep architecture, as it occurs during the micro-awakenings that happen throughout the night, those brief moments when your brain briefly surfaces from deeper sleep stages before sinking back down again. During these micro-awakenings, which typically last only a few seconds to perhaps a minute at most, the brain somehow generates these compressed, hyperefficient dream experiences that pack emotional weight and narrative into impossibly small windows of time. The mechanism appears to involve a sudden surge of activity in the visual cortex and emotional processing regions, while your prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical analysis and reality testing, remains partially offline or subdued. This creates the perfect storm for the generation of bizarre dream content that feels absolutely compelling and real in the moment, yet leaves almost no trace in memory by morning. What makes microdreams particularly fascinating is that they seem to serve no obvious biological function, yet they persist across all human populations regardless of culture, age, or sleep quality. We have simply accepted their existence as a normal quirk of the sleeping mind, much like we accept the strangeness of more elaborate dreams, rarely questioning why our brains bother to generate these fleeting phantoms that will be forgotten almost instantly. Among the most universally reported and deeply unsettling dream experiences across human cultures lies the phenomenon of teeth falling out, a nocturnal vision so common that dental professionals have noted countless patients describing this exact scenario during routine appointments, often with a sense of lingering dread that persists well into their waking hours. The dream typically manifests in various forms. Sometimes the teeth crumble slowly like aged concrete, sometimes they fall out in sudden clusters with an almost violent inevitability, and sometimes they simply dissolve into nothingness, leaving the dreamer frantically searching with their tongue for teeth that no longer exist in the dream's logic. The sensation is accompanied by a profound vulnerability, a nakedness of the mouth, and often a desperate scramble to catch the falling teeth as if recovering them might somehow reverse the damage, though in the dream state the teeth never stay intact, crumbling further or transforming into something else entirely. This experience cuts across age groups, cultures, and economic backgrounds with remarkable consistency, suggesting something fundamentally human about the anxiety it represents. The psychological mechanism underlying this dream appears rooted in several intersecting layers of human consciousness and concern. Teeth represent not merely biological functionality, but status, attractiveness, power, and control in almost every society, making them symbolically dense in ways that few other body parts achieve. When we lose teeth in dreams, we are experiencing the loss of something we perceive as central to our identity and social presence, a vulnerability that threatens our ability to present ourselves competently to the world around us. Additionally, teeth have been historically connected with aging, mortality, and the inevitable decline of the physical body, so their loss in dreams may represent deeper anxieties about time passing and the body's ultimate betrayal of consciousness. Some psychologists suggest that teeth-falling dreams emerge during periods of significant life stress, major transitions, or when we feel powerless in waking circumstances, as though our subconscious mind selected teeth specifically because their loss is simultaneously irreversible and deeply personal. Consider the peculiar phenomenon where a person falls asleep with a specific expectation lodged firmly in their mind, and their dream almost inevitably conjures a scenario that satisfies or confirms that very expectation, as though the sleeping mind were an eager servant devoted entirely to the fulfillment of what the conscious mind had planted before sleep claimed them. A student who goes to bed convinced they will dream about failing an exam finds themselves standing in a classroom where everything they studied has mysteriously vanished from their memory, while another person who expects to dream of a lost loved one discovers themselves in a familiar kitchen where that person sits at a worn wooden table, smiling as though they never left at all. The mechanism at work here involves the brain's remarkable capacity for pattern recognition and confirmation bias, which doesn't simply shut down when consciousness fades, but rather becomes even more pronounced and malleable, freed from the rational constraints that normally temper our waking thoughts. Our expectations act as powerful mental filters that prime the dream-generating systems of the brain to search through the vast archive of memories, emotions, and imagery for material that aligns with what we anticipated we would experience. And the sleeping brain, operating under different rules than the waking mind, finds this task almost trivially easy to accomplish with remarkable precision and emotional resonance. What makes this theory particularly strange is that we have essentially accepted this as a normal aspect of human experience, rarely questioning why our dreams should be so obligingly tailored to our preconceived notions, never pausing to acknowledge that the dream world seems almost suspiciously responsive to our conscious desires and fears, behaving less like a random neural firing and more like a thought-treating entity that has somehow gained access to our midnight hopes and anxieties. Yet we continue to go to bed, we continue to harbor expectations, and we continue to wake with dreams that validate those expectations. And this cycle perpetuates itself night after night with an eerie consistency that suggests either a remarkable neurological coincidence or something more intentional operating beneath the surface of sleep. Throughout human history, individuals have reported experiencing vivid dreams in which they actively work through complex problems, mathematical equations, creative challenges, or logistical dilemmas that have been occupying their waking minds. And upon awakening, they often find themselves possessed of novel insights, unexpected solutions, or entirely new perspectives on issues that had previously seemed intractable or impossibly difficult. The phenomenon occurs with such regularity that it has become almost universally recognized as a legitimate cognitive process, with countless documented cases of scientists, artists, engineers, and thinkers of all varieties crediting their most significant breakthroughs to dreams that arrived during the night, solutions that seem to materialize fully formed from the unconscious mind without any apparent conscious deliberation. The mechanism underlying this curious process is thought to rest upon the unique neurological state that occurs during REM sleep, when the prefrontal cortex responsible for logical analysis and critical judgment enters a state of relative deactivation, while simultaneously the emotional and associative regions of the brain become extraordinarily active. Allowing for novel connections to be made between disparate concepts and memories that would normally remain separated by the gatekeeping functions of rational thought. In this altered neurological landscape, the dreaming mind appears capable of approaching problems from angles that the waking mind cannot access, making unexpected associations and leaping across logical barriers that conscious reasoning would typically enforce as insurmountable obstacles. Yet despite the plausibility of this explanation and the genuine documented instances of such dream-facilitated breakthroughs, The phenomenon persists in our collective consciousness as something approaching the magical or miraculous, as though the unconscious mind possessed some manner of superior intelligence or intuitive wisdom that could somehow transcend the limitations of the physical brain itself. We continue to speak of dreams offering us answers, as though some external force were communicating with us through the nighttime visions, rather than accepting the simpler explanation that our own minds are simply operating under different conditions and with different constraints than those imposed during waking consciousness. The experience of being chased in a dream remains one of the most universal and viscerally disturbing nocturnal phenomena that humans report, occurring across cultures, age groups, and psychological profiles with remarkable consistency, and it typically manifests as a sensation of desperate flight through unfamiliar or warped landscapes, while some undefined threat pursues relentlessly from behind, growing ever closer despite one's frantic attempts to escape or increase speed. The physical manifestation of this dream state is particularly peculiar because the dreamer often experiences a profound sense of heaviness in their limbs, as if moving through thick water or molasses, while the pursuer somehow maintains an accelerating pace that defies the laws of physics and rational movement. The pursuer themselves rarely possesses clear definition or recognizable form in most accounts, existing instead as a shadowy presence or amorphous threat that is somehow simultaneously terrifying and indescribable, which creates a unique psychological tension because the mind cannot fully process what it fears. From a neurological perspective, this phenomenon appears to stem from the activation of the brain's threat detection systems during the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, when the prefrontal cortex responsible for logic and rational thought becomes largely inactive while the amygdala and other emotional centers operate at heightened intensity. The body during this state is essentially experiencing genuine fear responses, with elevated heart rate and stress hormone release, yet simultaneously experiencing the physical paralysis that naturally occurs during REM sleep to prevent acting out dream movements, creating a deeply trapped sensation where the conscious mind screams to escape but the body remains locked in place. Evolutionary theorists propose that this chase scenario may have ancient roots in our ancestors' survival mechanisms, where fleeing from predators was genuinely necessary for continuation of the species. And perhaps these dreams represent the activation of those primordial fear circuits, even though the modern human faces no such threats while sleeping in their controlled environments. Yet despite our intellectual understanding that we are safe in our beds, despite knowing rationally that we are merely dreaming and that no actual pursuer exists, the terror persists with remarkable stubbornness, suggesting that some aspects of human fear operate at levels beneath conscious reasoning and cannot be simply talked away through rational analysis or logical reassurance. Consider the peculiar state that occurs in those moments immediately following wakefulness, when you find yourself suspended between the world of sleep and the world of consciousness, aware enough to recognize that you are no longer dreaming, yet not quite fully present in your surroundings. This threshold phenomenon, known as hypnopompia, represents one of the most consistently reported, yet profoundly misunderstood experiences in human neurology, a liminal space where the boundaries between imagination and reality become remarkably porous and difficult to navigate with any certainty. During this transitional period, which can last anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, your brain remains partially engaged in the dream state while simultaneously beginning to process external sensory information, creating a peculiar overlay of both experiences occurring simultaneously within your conscious awareness. Many people report seeing shadowy figures standing at the foot of their bed, experiencing a sensation of paralysis that prevents them from moving their limbs despite being awake, or hearing disembodied voices calling their names with unmistakable clarity, all while maintaining some awareness that these phenomena may not be entirely real. The psychological mechanism underlying hypnopompia involves the incomplete transition between REM sleep, during which your voluntary muscles are naturally paralyzed to prevent you from acting out your dreams, and wakefulness, when your conscious mind should be taking full control of your sensory processing and motor functions. When this transition occurs unevenly, your conscious awareness awakens before this motor control has fully returned, leaving you acutely aware but unable to move, while simultaneously your brain is still generating the vivid hallucinations characteristic of REM sleep, creating a deeply disturbing fusion of lucidity and imagery. Despite our modern understanding of sleep neurology and the documented explanations for these experiences, hypnopompia continues to captivate human imagination and inspire supernatural interpretations, persisting as a cultural phenomenon where people across diverse societies and time periods have attributed these experiences to demonic visitation, alien abduction, or spiritual encounters, normalizing the experience into folklore rather than accepting the purely neurological explanation. Among the most universally reported and distinctly memorable categories of dreams exists the phenomenon of human flight, wherein the dreamer experiences the sensation of ascending into the air, propelling themselves through three-dimensional space, and navigating landscapes from an aerial perspective that defies the constraints of waking physics. This experience occurs with remarkable consistency across cultures, historical periods, and demographic groups, suggesting something fundamental about the human imagination's relationship with the concept of liberation from gravitational limitation. When examining the mechanics of how these dreams manifest in the sleeping mind, one discovers that the dreamer typically does not question the impossibility of their circumstance, nor do they experience the logical distress that would accompany such an event in waking life, but rather they accept the ability to fly as a natural extension of their dream environment, swimming through air as though it possessed the same properties as water, or simply willing themselves upward through pure intention. The psychological mechanisms underlying flying dreams have long been theorized to represent desires for freedom, escape from constraints, elevation of perspective beyond ordinary limitations, or the acquisition of power and control over one's circumstances and environment. Neuroscientific perspectives suggest that during REM sleep, the brain's rational evaluation systems experience reduced activity, while imaginative and emotional centers remain highly engaged, creating conditions where the laws of physics simply do not register as violations requiring explanation or resistance. Yet despite decades of scientific understanding regarding sleep neurology and dream generation, the phenomenon persists as something that captures human fascination and generates sustained discussion, as though the logical explanations for why we experience weightlessness and impossible motion somehow fail to fully account for the profound psychological impact of the experience itself. The dream of flying remains resistant to being completely demystified by science, continuing to provoke wonder and speculation about what deeper truths it might express regarding human aspiration, our relationship with limitation, and our capacity to imagine states of being that transcend the ordinary conditions of embodied existence in the waking world. Consider the peculiar phenomenon that occurs to nearly every human being with remarkable consistency. You spend roughly 6 years of your life dreaming, yet you retain almost nothing of those experiences upon waking. You might emerge from 8 hours of sleep with a vague impression of movement or emotion, perhaps a fragmented image that dissolves within moments, and then nothing remains except the certainty that something occurred while you were unconscious. This is dream amnesia, and it represents one of the most universal yet profoundly strange aspects of human consciousness, a built-in erasure mechanism that systematically deletes entire narratives and experiences from your memory as though they never happened at all. Throughout the night, your brain constructs elaborate scenarios with coherent logic, emotional weight, and sensory detail, yet by the time you've brushed your teeth and started your day, those entire worlds have evaporated completely. The mechanism behind this amnesia appears to involve the neurochemistry of sleep itself, specifically the absence of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter crucial for memory formation and retention. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, your brain's levels of norepinephrine drop to near zero, creating a neurochemical environment where memories simply cannot be encoded into long-term storage with the same efficiency they would be during waking hours. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped structure responsible for transferring information from short-term to long-term memory, essentially operates without one of its essential tools, leaving dreams to exist in a sort of temporary mental space that is neither fully formed nor capable of lasting retention. Additionally, during sleep, the prefrontal cortex, which handles logical reasoning and reality testing, shows reduced activity, meaning that dreams, no matter how bizarre or contradictory, feel completely coherent and believable while they occur. Yet this same reduction in prefrontal activity may also impair the metacognitive processes necessary for encoding autobiographical memories. What makes this phenomenon particularly strange is that we have normalized it entirely, accepting dream amnesia as inevitable and unremarkable. Yet if this same memory loss occurred during waking hours, it would be considered catastrophic. If you experience several hours of conscious activity each day that you could not subsequently recall, you would seek immediate medical attention, fearing neurological disease or cognitive decline. Consider the fundamental strangeness of what occurs when you dream, that peculiar state in which the laws of physics, logic, and causality simply dissolve into something far more elastic and inexplicable. You find yourself in a location that is simultaneously your childhood home and a shopping mall, the architecture shifting and transforming with each glance, rooms connecting to impossible places, staircases leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Your childhood friend appears beside you, but their face is blurred or constantly shifting, sometimes becoming a stranger, sometimes becoming yourself, and yet you accept this without question or concern. You attempt to run from some unnamed threat, but your legs move through thick molasses, your screams emerge silently, your hands pass through solid objects as though they were made of water, and still your mind does not rebel against these fundamental violations of how reality should work. Water flows upward. Colors have sounds. You understand complex mathematics that evaporates the moment you wake. Time moves in strange increments, hours passing in what felt like minutes, or entire years compressed into a single night, and somehow your dreaming mind accepts all of this with remarkable equanimity. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the deactivation of your prefrontal cortex, the very region responsible for logic, critical analysis, and reality testing, while simultaneously your limbic system remains hyperactive, generating emotions and narrative impulses. Your brain constructs these bizarre scenarios from fragmentary memories, emotional residue, random neural firing patterns, and the strange associations your mind makes during REM sleep, weaving them together into narratives that violate every rational principle you consciously uphold while awake. What proves truly remarkable is that despite possessing decades of waking experience that has thoroughly taught you how reality actually operates, you do not question these dreams while experiencing them, you do not attempt to apply logic to them, you simply inhabit them as though they were perfectly normal occurrences. Upon waking, you recognize immediately how absurd they were, how impossible their physics and narrative logic proved to be. Yet this recognition does nothing to prevent the exact same bizarre acceptance from occurring the very next night, suggesting that your dreaming mind and waking mind operate according to fundamentally different rules, different acceptance criteria for what constitutes plausible reality, and neither seems capable of permanently teaching the other. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of Maya, an ancient Sanskrit concept that describes the illusory nature of reality itself, and how this philosophical framework has somehow embedded itself into the way modern dreamers interpret their nocturnal experiences, creating a recursive loop where the dream becomes indistinguishable from waking thought. In the real world, people who have encountered Hindu and Buddhist philosophy often find themselves lying awake at night, wondering whether their dreams constitute a layer of Maya, a veil of illusion that obscures some deeper truth beneath the surface of consciousness. And this wondering itself becomes so consuming that it begins to blur the boundaries between intellectual curiosity and genuine metaphysical anxiety. They wake from vivid dreams convinced that something profound has occurred, that perhaps their dreaming mind has glimpsed through the curtain of illusion to perceive reality more clearly than their waking mind ever could. And they spend their mornings contemplating whether the emotions felt during these dreams were more real than the emotions they experience while walking through their daily routines. The psychological mechanism underlying this interpretation stems from humanity's ancient need to find deeper meaning in the unexplainable aspects of consciousness. And when presented with a philosophical framework that suggests reality itself might be illusory, the mind seizes upon dreams as evidence that we have already been living within layers of illusion all along. Dreams, after all, feel real while we are experiencing them, and once we wake and recognize their unreality, the question naturally follows whether our waking state might similarly be a dream from which we have not yet awakened, creating a vertiginous philosophical regression that feeds itself. What persists despite having no logical foundation is the assumption that recognizing the illusory nature of dreams somehow grants us access to truth, when in fact it simply acknowledges that consciousness can be deceived, a capability that applies equally to all states of awareness. We have normalized this concept to such an extent that many people now approach their dreams with the assumption that deeper wisdom lies within them, that the dream is not merely a byproduct of neural activity, but rather a message encoded in symbol and metaphor. And this normalization has transformed what might be a simple observation about the subjective nature of experience into an elaborate metaphysical system that shapes how people understand their own minds. Throughout history and across nearly every culture on Earth, humans have developed elaborate systems for interpreting dreams as messages or signs from deeper realms, whether those realms be spiritual, divine, psychological, or metaphysical in nature. People wake from vivid dreams and immediately consult dream interpretation guides, seeking to decode what their subconscious mind was supposedly attempting to communicate through the symbolic language of sleeping visions. If someone dreams of water, it might signify emotions or the unconscious mind itself, while dreams of falling could represent a loss of control, and dreams of being chased might indicate avoidance of something in waking life. These interpretations have become so standardized that entire industries have built themselves around dream analysis, with books, websites, and practitioners dedicated to translating the alleged symbolic messages that emerge from our sleeping brains into meaningful guidance for our conscious lives. The fundamental mechanism underlying this belief system operates on the principle that our brains, freed from the constraints of waking logic and social filtering during sleep, express genuine truths about our deepest concerns, fears, and desires through metaphorical imagery. The dream becomes a kind of psychological mirror, reflecting back aspects of ourselves that we might not consciously acknowledge or understand while awake. Our minds are pattern recognition machines that are exceptionally skilled at finding meaning and connection between seemingly unrelated elements, and this cognitive tendency becomes especially pronounced when we attempt to interpret the chaotic, nonlinear narratives that characterize dreams. What persists as remarkable is how we continue to treat dreams as having inherent meaning that can be decoded and applied to our waking decisions and understanding of ourselves, despite the complete lack of empirical evidence that dream symbolism operates according to any consistent universal rules. The very same dream image carries entirely different meanings depending on which cultural tradition or psychological framework one consults, suggesting that the meaning is being imposed upon the dream rather than inherent within it. Yet the practice endures, normalized in therapeutic settings, casual conversation, and personal reflection, because the act of interpreting our dreams gives us a profound sense that our subconscious minds are communicating with us, that there is wisdom and guidance available if only we can learn to listen to these mysterious nighttime messages in the proper way. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of how your mind appears to organize itself during sleep, sorting through the chaos of the day's experiences without any conscious direction or deliberate effort on your part. The self-organization theory of dreams suggests that your brain, during REM sleep, engages in a spontaneous process of categorization and pattern recognition, where neural networks activate in seemingly random sequences, yet somehow produce coherent narratives and meaningful associations without requiring any executive oversight or intentional guidance from your waking consciousness. During these hours of sleep, your brain's default mode network becomes hyperactive while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical reasoning and conscious control, becomes notably quieter, allowing various regions of your neural architecture to communicate and reorganize information in ways that would never occur during your waking hours. This theory proposes that dreams emerge not from some hidden purposeful mechanism designed to heal or process emotions, but rather from the brain's inherent tendency to seek patterns and create order from disorder, much like how water naturally organizes itself into flowing streams or how particles arrange themselves into crystalline structures without any external intelligence directing them. The mechanism operates on the principle that your brain simply cannot tolerate chaos and randomness, so it automatically searches for connections between disparate firing patterns, linking memories together, creating narratives that feel meaningful even when they emerge from fundamentally random neural activation. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is how our minds have normalized this self-organizing behavior as something mysterious and profound, attributing deep significance to dreams when the underlying process may be nothing more than your brain's natural inclination to impose order and narrative coherence upon electrical signals that have no inherent meaning, yet paradoxically, this automatic organization often produces insights and creative solutions that seem far more sophisticated than our conscious minds could generate, suggesting that perhaps the most profound intelligence emerges not from directed effort, but from allowing systems to organize themselves without interference. There exists among dreamers a peculiar and nearly universal experience in which the sleeping mind conjures a scenario of profound social vulnerability, where the dreamer finds themselves stripped of clothing in a populated or semi-populated space, exposed to the gaze of strangers, colleagues, or acquaintances who continue about their business with varying degrees of awareness or indifference to this state of undress. The dreamer typically experiences acute distress during these episodes, feeling an overwhelming sense of shame and panic that seems entirely disproportionate to the actual circumstance, since in most instances no one in the dream appears genuinely concerned or even particularly attentive to their nakedness, yet the emotional response remains intense and visceral nonetheless. The experience often involves frantic attempts to cover oneself, to locate clothing, or to escape the situation entirely, accompanied by a peculiar dream logic in which neither solution proves readily available or effective, as clothes disappear from grasp or escape routes lead only to more populated areas. This dream phenomenon appears to derive from the fundamental human anxiety about social judgment and the violation of privacy, representing a literalization of the metaphorical exposure that occurs when one fears being perceived as inadequate, dishonest, or fundamentally flawed by others. The nakedness functions as a symbol for the removal of all protective social layers, all the careful presentations and carefully constructed personas that individuals maintain in waking life, exposing what remains underneath when all pretense is stripped away. Psychologically, the dream may process anxieties about authenticity and social acceptance by presenting the worst conceivable version of exposure, forcing the dreamer to contemplate what would actually happen if the boundaries of privacy and propriety were completely obliterated. Yet despite our evolutionary progress and modern understanding of human psychology, this dream persists across cultures and generations with remarkable consistency, suggesting that the fear of social nakedness remains deeply encoded within human consciousness, still triggering alarm responses even in the safe space of sleep, where no genuine threat exists, revealing how powerfully our sense of self remains tethered to external validation and social appearance. Within the darkened chambers of the womb, surrounded by amniotic fluid and the rhythmic pulse of maternal heartbeat, the developing human fetus exists in a state that neuroscientists have long theorized might constitute something resembling dreaming, though whether this phenomenon deserves that designation remains profoundly uncertain and contested among researchers who study the earliest stages of human consciousness and neural development. During the later stages of gestation, particularly in the third trimester, fetal brain activity shows patterns of rapid eye movement sleep, the very stage of sleep during which adults experience their most vivid and narrative-driven dreams, suggesting that the fetus, already practicing breathing motions and grasping reflexes, might simultaneously be cycling through dream states in preparation for the complexity of conscious experience it will soon encounter upon birth. The theory proposes that these prenatal dreams, if they can be called that, serve a developmental purpose rather than a psychological one, functioning as a neural rehearsal system in which the fetus's developing brain simulates sensory experiences and motor patterns, creating internal narratives of movement and sensation that help wire the neural pathways responsible for coordination, proprioception, and basic awareness of its own body existing in space and time. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is how it challenges our fundamental understanding of what dreaming requires, since classical definitions emphasize sensory input, memory processing, and the integration of experiences. Yet the fetus has experienced relatively little of the external world beyond muffled sounds, pressure, temperature, and the chemical signatures present in amniotic fluid. Meaning any dreams occurring would be constructed almost entirely from the fetus's own developing neural tissue, essentially pure consciousness creating imagery from nothing but its own biological imperative to prepare itself for life. The mechanism appears rooted in the brain's apparent need to simulate reality even before it has fully encountered that reality, much as a musician might hear music in their mind before performing it, or as an athlete visualizes movements before executing them, suggesting that the neural architecture responsible for imagination and mental modeling begins its work long before birth, preparing the organism for the specifics of existence it cannot yet know. Consider for a moment the profound mystery surrounding the dreams of those who have been blind since birth, a phenomenon that challenges our fundamental assumptions about how the human mind constructs its nocturnal narratives and visual landscapes. People who have never experienced sight in their waking lives still report vivid, complex dreams, yet these dreams are constructed entirely without the visual component that sighted individuals take for granted as essential to the dreaming process. The dreams of the congenitally blind are not empty or void of content, but rather they are richly populated with sensory experiences that incorporate sound, touch, smell, taste, and proprioception in ways that create coherent and emotionally resonant dreamscapes. These individuals describe dreams where they navigate spaces, interact with other people, and experience events with complete clarity and immersion, despite lacking the visual framework that most sighted people assume is necessary for such experiences to feel real and substantial. The psychological and neurological mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to involve the brain's remarkable capacity to construct experiential reality through whatever sensory channels are available to it. When a person born without sight enters the dream state, their brain does not generate visual images in the way that sighted people's brains do, but instead creates multisensory experiences that are equally vivid and equally capable of producing emotional responses, spatial awareness, and narrative coherence. The brain seems to use the sensory modalities that the individual has experienced throughout their life to build the dream environment, meaning that the world of a blind person's dream might be constructed primarily through the spatial relationships created by sound and echolocation principles, through the tactile sensation of movement and contact, and through the emotional and conceptual understanding of spaces and objects that they have learned through navigation and interaction. The visual cortex of a person who has never seen remains active during dreams, and some research suggests that this region may be repurposed to process other types of sensory information, transforming it into a sort of multisensory synthesis that creates a fully experienced dream world. What makes this phenomenon particularly curious and worthy of extended reflection is how it fundamentally disrupts the assumption that vision is the primary or dominant sense through which human experience is constructed and remembered. The wild technique, which stands for Wake-Initiated Lucid Dream, represents one of the most perplexing and mechanically fascinating approaches to accessing the lucid dreaming state, and it operates on a premise that seems almost paradoxical in its fundamental logic. The technique involves maintaining conscious awareness while your body falls asleep, essentially attempting to keep your mind awake and observing while your physical form transitions into the sleep state. And this requires an extraordinarily delicate balance between wakefulness and unconsciousness that most practitioners find intensely difficult to achieve. A person attempting the wild technique typically lies in a comfortable position, often on their back, and begins focusing their attention inward while remaining as still as possible, monitoring the various physical sensations that arise as the body begins its descent into sleep, including the characteristic hypnagogic experiences such as vibrations, spinning sensations, or the feeling of floating. The fundamental mechanism behind why this technique theoretically works relates to the neuroscience of sleep transitions, particularly the distinction between the various stages of consciousness and the roles of different brain regions during different sleep phases. When you typically fall asleep, your consciousness fades gradually and you lose awareness of the transition itself. But by maintaining a thread of conscious observation throughout this process, a person engaging in wild attempts to create a situation where they enter the dream state with their consciousness still functioning and aware, essentially bridging the gap between waking awareness and dream consciousness in a way that allows them to recognize they are dreaming once they fully enter REM sleep. The psychological aspect involves training your attention and developing an almost meditative quality of awareness that can coexist with the drowsiness that naturally arises, and this requires immense patience and repeated failed attempts before success becomes possible. What remains particularly strange about the persistence of the wild technique, despite its remarkable difficulty, is that so many people continue to pursue it with dedication despite success rates being remarkably low for the general population, suggesting that the human fascination with controlling consciousness through technique and discipline remains a powerful motivator regardless of practical outcomes. Have you ever watched a dog sleeping on your couch, its paws twitching rapidly while small whimpers escape from its throat, and wondered what world it might be exploring in its unconscious mind? Have you observed a cat's whiskers trembling as its eyes move beneath closed lids, seemingly tracking something invisible across a dreamscape only it can perceive? These observations form the basis of one of the most enchanting yet scientifically murky territories in sleep research: the question of whether animals truly dream as we do. When we examine the physiological markers of dreaming in animals, we discover that many creatures display rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, the stage most closely associated with vivid dreaming in humans, suggesting that the neurological infrastructure for dreaming exists across a surprisingly wide range of species. Rats show distinctive patterns of brain activity during sleep that researchers have observed correlating with their waking behavior, leading some neuroscientists to theorize that these rodents may be replaying their daily experiences during sleep, much as humans are theorized to do. Primates display sleep architectures strikingly similar to our own, with proportionally comparable amounts of REM sleep and non-REM sleep cycling throughout their rest periods. Yet despite this observable neurological similarity, we remain fundamentally uncertain about the subjective experience of animal dreams, unable to ask a sleeping elephant what visions occupy its vast mind or what emotions accompany a bird's flickering eyelids during slumber. The persistence of this question reveals something profound about how we have normalized our uncertainty regarding consciousness itself. We have accepted that we cannot definitively know the inner experiences of other minds, whether human or animal, and yet we continue to speculate, to theorize, and to feel a peculiar certainty that something real is happening behind those closed animal eyes, even when science can only tell us about the mechanical correlates of sleep and brain waves. Perhaps this is where art and science meet, in our willingness to honor the mystery of animal consciousness not by solving it, but by acknowledging that the twitching paws and trembling whiskers represent something meaningful, even if we can never fully translate it into human language or understanding. The notion that consuming cheese before bedtime will inevitably lead to disturbing dreams and nightmares has persisted across cultures and generations, passed down through families, reinforced by late-night conversations, and perpetuated in popular folklore with remarkable consistency despite the absence of any rigorous scientific evidence to support such a claim. Many people report that after eating cheese in the evening, particularly rich varieties like cheddar or blue cheese, they experience more vivid, more disturbing, and more memorable dreams than they would after nights when they abstain from dairy products entirely. These individuals describe nightmares of unusual intensity and peculiarity, dreams that seem to carry greater emotional weight and psychological impact than their typical nocturnal experiences, leading them to firmly believe that the cheese itself was the direct cause of their compromised sleep quality and their troubled dream states. The mechanism behind this belief likely stems from the fact that cheese is difficult to digest, particularly when consumed close to bedtime, which means the digestive system remains active while the body attempts to enter sleep, potentially disrupting the normal sleep cycles and causing more frequent awakenings during the night. When we experience more awakenings during sleep, we naturally recall more of our dreams, as these moments of semi-consciousness provide windows during which our brains can transfer dream memories into our conscious awareness, creating the false impression that we are simply dreaming more vividly or experiencing more nightmares, when in fact we are simply remembering our dreams with greater frequency and clarity. Additionally, cheese contains tyramine and other naturally occurring compounds that can influence brain chemistry and potentially affect the dreaming process itself, though these effects are generally understood to be minimal and subtle rather than transformative or nightmare-inducing in any dramatic sense. The myth has become so thoroughly woven into our collective consciousness that people often unconsciously expect cheese to cause nightmares, and through the powerful mechanism of the placebo effect, combined with the natural tendency to remember dreams more readily when we experience sleep disruptions, people convince themselves that their expectations have been confirmed and their beliefs have been validated by direct personal experience. During the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, your body enters a peculiar state of complete muscular paralysis that persists throughout the entire duration of your dream sequences. And this phenomenon, known as REM Atonia, represents one of the most profound disconnections between your conscious intention and your physical capability that any human being will ever experience during their lifetime. While your eyes dart frantically beneath your eyelids and your brain generates vivid narratives filled with impossible scenarios and emotional intensity, every voluntary muscle in your body except your diaphragm becomes essentially frozen in place, unable to respond to commands or generate movement, despite the fact that your mind may be desperately running or fighting or fleeing from some perceived threat within the dream landscape. The mechanism behind this remarkable paralysis operates through a sophisticated neurological system involving the pontine tegmentum, a region deep within your brainstem that actively suppresses motor neurons and prevents the transmission of motor commands from your brain down through your spinal cord to your muscles, creating a deliberate biochemical blockade that ensures your sleeping body remains motionless while your dreaming mind experiences vivid sensations of motion and agency. This system evolved as a protective mechanism, theoretically preventing you from physically acting out your dreams and potentially harming yourself or others during sleep. Yet the profound weirdness of the experience lies in how your consciousness remains partially aware of this paralysis in certain circumstances, such as during lucid dreams or during the transitional states between sleep and waking when your mind has begun to wake, but your body has not yet received the signal to release the paralytic hold. Throughout human history, this state has inspired countless interpretations and folklore narratives, from accounts of demonic possession to alien abduction experiences to visits from supernatural entities, all stemming from the disorienting reality of being mentally conscious but physically trapped, unable to move, often unable to speak, sometimes experiencing hallucinations or a profound sense of pressure upon the chest that many cultures have attributed to paranormal causes. Among the most persistent anxieties that follow us into sleep is the fear that if we die in our dreams, we will die in real life, a belief so widespread and deeply embedded in human culture that it has survived centuries of rational thinking and scientific advancement without losing its grip on our collective imagination. When someone experiences a dream in which they are killed, shot, falling from an impossible height, or suffering some catastrophic injury that results in their final moment of consciousness, they often wake with a startled gasp, their heart racing, and the overwhelming sense that they have narrowly escaped something genuinely dangerous, as though death itself has reached for them in the night and been repelled only by their sudden awakening. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in how our brains process threat and consciousness during sleep. For when we dream of dying, our neurological systems are simulating danger with remarkable fidelity, activating the same fear centers and survival instincts that would trigger an actual mortal peril, creating an experience so vivid and emotionally intense that the boundary between simulation and reality becomes almost imperceptible in the moment of waking. Furthermore, the brain's inability to fully distinguish between dreamed and waking reality during the hypnagogic transition between sleep and consciousness means that the physiological panic response is entirely real even though the threat is not, and this genuine fear response becomes entangled with the abstract concept of death itself, reinforcing the conviction that something supernatural or dangerous has occurred. What makes this belief particularly resistant to logical dismantling is the simple fact that we have never encountered a person who has died in their sleep as a direct result of dying in a dream. Yet somehow this evidence of safety has not diminished the fear, suggesting that the anxiety persists not because of rational assessment, but because it operates on a deeper level of human psychology where symbolic death triggers primal responses regardless of empirical contradiction. And we continue to harbor this fear, even as we logically acknowledge that millions of people dream of death every night and wake to experience countless more tomorrows. Consider the peculiar habit that has emerged among lucid dreamers and those fascinated by the nature of consciousness itself, a practice known as performing reality checks throughout the waking day. These individuals develop routines of repeatedly testing whether they are dreaming or awake, examining their hands to count fingers, attempting to push their fingers through their palms, looking at text to see if it remains stable, or pinching their own skin to feel whether sensation registers as it should. The underlying assumption is that these physical tests will behave differently in dreams than in waking reality, creating a kind of early warning system that should alert the dreamer to their dreaming state when they perform the same checks while asleep. The theory proposes that through constant repetition during the day, the habit becomes so deeply ingrained that it will automatically carry over into dream scenarios, eventually triggering the realization that one is dreaming because the reality check will fail in unexpected ways. What is fascinating about this theory is that it rests upon the belief that our brains, even in the artificial realm of dreams where physics need not apply and our own consciousness is entirely in control, will somehow forget to simulate consistent results from these tests. The psychological mechanism operating here involves habit formation, the powerful human tendency to automate behaviors through repetition, combined with a kind of optimistic assumption that our dreaming minds will somehow cooperate with our waking intentions. Yet despite the logical inconsistency that our own dreams should behave however we unconsciously desire them to behave, people continue to perform these checks with genuine hope that they will work, that tonight might be the night when their fingers refuse to align properly in a dream, that text might suddenly become illegible, that the laws of dream physics might suddenly betray themselves. The persistence of this practice persists despite the fundamental paradox that we have normalized it entirely, treating it as reasonable methodology rather than acknowledging the almost magical thinking required to believe that our unconscious minds will reliably sabotage the consistency of our own dreams so that our waking selves can gain access to lucidity. Within certain Tibetan Buddhist traditions and contemporary wellness movements exists a practice known as dream yoga, a discipline that proposes humans can develop conscious awareness and control within the dream state itself, treating nocturnal visions not as passive experiences, but as malleable terrain for spiritual development and psychological transformation. Practitioners of dream yoga engage in specific meditation techniques during waking hours, cultivating what they call dream sign recognition, whereby they train themselves to identify recurring patterns, impossible physics, or logical inconsistencies that appear within their dreams, such as text that refuses to remain stable or light sources that behave erratically, with the ultimate goal being to recognize these anomalies while dreaming and thereby trigger lucid awareness within the dream itself. The practice involves elaborate pre-sleep rituals and intention setting, where individuals lie in specific positions, focus their awareness on the space between their eyes, and mentally rehearse the moment they will recognize they are dreaming, creating what practitioners describe as a bridge between conscious will and unconscious processing. The psychological mechanism underlying dream yoga suggests that the human brain maintains certain capacities for self-reflection and pattern recognition even during sleep, and that by deliberately training attention through repeated visualization and focused intention during waking hours, these neural pathways can be strengthened and activated during dream states when the prefrontal cortex, normally responsible for logical analysis, operates under different conditions. Advocates propose that lucid dreaming, far from being mere entertainment, represents genuine access to consciousness itself, a state where the dreamer can allegedly practice emotional regulation, confront fears in a safe environment, and explore aspects of identity without external constraints. What remains peculiar is how dream yoga has gained substantial traction in contemporary mindfulness circles and therapeutic contexts, despite the fact that most individuals who attempt the practice fail to achieve consistent lucid dreaming, and despite the absence of universally accepted scientific mechanisms explaining how intention during waking consciousness could reliably trigger metacognitive awareness during sleep when brain chemistry differs dramatically. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of color perception during sleep, where the dreaming mind generates vivid chromatic experiences that seem as real and saturated as waking vision. Yet neuroscience suggests that the visual cortex operates differently during REM sleep than during conscious hours, and yet we consistently report experiencing full spectrums of color in our dreams with remarkable clarity and emotional resonance. The experience itself is undeniable. People awaken from dreams and describe brilliant reds, deep blues, luminous greens, and impossible hues that seem to glow from within, colors that felt more intense than reality itself, colors that carried emotional weight and meaning beyond their mere visual properties. This raises an immediate puzzle, because if we accept that dreams are fundamentally reconstructions of memory and imagination rather than direct sensory input, then the question becomes not whether we see color in dreams, but how we generate the precise sensation of color without external light stimulation entering the eye. And whether the colors we experience in dreams are truly equivalent to waking colors, or if we are experiencing something fundamentally different that we have simply learned to call by the same names. The mechanism appears to involve the visual cortex activating internally during sleep, drawing upon stored memories of colors and visual experiences to construct dream imagery, and yet the brain during REM sleep shows different patterns of activation than during waking perception, particularly in areas responsible for logical analysis and external awareness, which suggests that the colors we experience might be generated through a different neural process entirely. Some researchers theorize that the vividness of dream colors might actually exceed what we experience while awake, because the dreaming brain is unconstrained by the filtering mechanisms that normally regulate sensory input, allowing color experiences to be amplified and intensified beyond normal parameters. What persists despite our growing understanding of sleep neurology is the fundamental mystery of subjective color experience itself. We cannot explain why the wavelength of light produces the sensation of redness rather than some other quale entirely, whether in waking or sleeping states, and this gap in our understanding means that dream colors remain enigmatic even as we map the brain regions that generate them, leaving us in the peculiar position of accepting vivid color in dreams as completely normal while simultaneously being unable to fully explain how color sensation arises in any context whatsoever. When you dream, you encounter people who speak, interact, and possess distinct personalities, yet upon waking you realize that every single one of these characters was generated entirely by your own mind, a phenomenon so pervasive that we rarely pause to consider its profound strangeness. These dream characters often feel like autonomous beings with their own thoughts, desires, and motivations, yet they emerge from the same consciousness that is experiencing them, creating a peculiar situation where your mind is essentially conducting conversations with itself, while simultaneously believing those conversations are genuine exchanges with separate entities. The mechanism behind this lies in the compartmentalization of consciousness during sleep, where different neural networks activate independently, allowing the brain to simulate social interaction by fragmenting itself into multiple processing streams that each feels subjectively real and distinct. Your mind generates not only the dialogue, but also the other person's facial expressions, tone of voice, emotional reactions, and backstory, complete with memories you never created while awake, and yet your dreaming consciousness treats these fabrications as authentic encounters with actual people. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-awareness and logical reasoning, becomes less active during REM sleep, which explains why you do not immediately recognize that the person arguing with you or embracing you is actually a construction of your own neural tissue. What makes this phenomenon particularly bizarre is that dream characters sometimes possess knowledge or perspectives that seem to come from outside your conscious awareness, leading many people to wonder whether dreams might be tapping into some form of collective unconscious or external information source. Yet neuroscience suggests these surprising revelations are simply your brain accessing information stored in memory networks that your waking consciousness does not have immediate access to. We have normalized this strange duality so completely that we wake up and casually refer to dreams as though we visited actual people in actual places. Yet the architecture of human sleep neurobiology ensures that every companion, antagonist, and stranger in your dreams is fundamentally you, a recursive loop of self-generated consciousness that continues night after night without ever losing its capacity to convince you of its authenticity. Have you ever noticed that your sleep seems to move in predictable waves, as if some invisible metronome is quietly keeping time beneath your consciousness, orchestrating the rise and fall of your dream states throughout the night? This observation forms the basis of what sleep researchers call the 90-minute ultradian rhythm, a biological cycle that allegedly governs not only our sleep architecture, but supposedly extends into our waking hours as well, creating a pattern of heightened awareness and diminished focus that repeats like clockwork, whether we are resting or actively engaged in our daily tasks. The theory suggests that when you first lay your head down to sleep, your brain does not immediately plunge into the deepest stages of unconsciousness, but rather cycles through distinct phases in a rhythmic dance that takes approximately 90 minutes from beginning to end, moving from lighter sleep stages through deep sleep, and then back toward the surface where rapid eye movement sleep occurs, and then the entire sequence repeats itself, sometimes multiple times throughout the course of a single night. The mechanism behind this cycle, according to those who champion this theory, relates to the brain's need to balance different types of neural processing and memory consolidation, with each phase serving a specific biological function that cannot be compressed or accelerated without consequence. Some proponents further extrapolate this concept to suggest that the same 90-minute rhythm persists even when you are awake, creating natural windows of peak mental performance followed by inevitable troughs of fatigue and reduced concentration, which would theoretically mean that structuring your work and rest periods around these 90-minute intervals should optimize your productivity and mental clarity. Yet despite the intuitive appeal of this perfectly ordered biological system, the actual evidence supporting such a neat and universal cycle remains remarkably inconsistent and contested among sleep scientists, with individual variation accounting for significant differences in cycle length and structure from one person to another, and many researchers questioning whether such a rigid framework actually exists, or whether we have simply imposed this pattern onto the messy complexity of actual sleep biology because our minds crave order and predictability. Every night we experience dreams that feel vivid and real in the moment, dreams where we navigate strange worlds, encounter people we know, and experience emotions so intense they seem to define entire lifetimes. Yet within minutes of waking, these elaborate narratives dissolve into fragments, leaving us with only vague impressions and disconnected images that slip away like water through our fingers. This phenomenon of dream forgetting is so universal that we rarely question its peculiarity, accepting it as simply how the mind works, though when examined closely, it represents one of the most comprehensive erasure processes the human brain undertakes on a regular basis. The mechanism underlying this forgetting appears to be rooted in the neurochemical environment of the sleeping brain, specifically in the dramatic reduction of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter essential for memory formation and consolidation. During waking hours and even during non-rapid eye movement sleep, norepinephrine levels remain relatively stable, allowing the brain to encode experiences into long-term memory through a process involving the hippocampus and various cortical regions. But during REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, norepinephrine production drops to nearly zero, creating a neurochemical state fundamentally incompatible with the formation of stable memories. Without this crucial chemical messenger, the dream experiences, no matter how elaborate or emotionally charged, cannot cross the threshold into lasting memory, remaining instead as ephemeral mental events that exist only in the moment of their occurrence. Additionally, the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for logical thinking, self-awareness, and critical analysis, shows reduced activity during REM sleep, which may explain why dreams seem logical and coherent while we experience them yet appear bizarre and nonsensical upon reflection. What makes this process particularly striking is that despite understanding something about its neurochemical basis, we have not evolved mechanisms to counteract it, suggesting that perhaps dream forgetting serves some purpose, whether that purpose involves preventing the contamination of memory systems with the bizarre narratives generated during sleep, or whether it represents an evolutionary accident that persists because it causes no significant survival disadvantage. The dreamcatcher is a woven circular object traditionally crafted from willow branches and sinew by Native American tribes, particularly those of the Great Lakes and Northern Plains regions, featuring a loose webbing pattern in the center with feathers and beads hanging from the bottom. And this object has been placed above beds for generations with the explicit intention of filtering out nightmares while allowing pleasant dreams to pass through to the sleeper below. The mechanism is believed to work through a kind of spiritual or metaphysical sorting process, where bad dreams become entangled in the web's intricate strands and are destroyed by the morning sunlight, while good dreams somehow navigate through the openings in the web or slide down the feathers to reach the person sleeping, a concept that requires dreams to have some form of physical or semi-physical property that allows them to be caught, filtered, and sorted like material objects passing through a sieve. When we examine this belief through a psychological lens, we find that the dreamcatcher functions primarily as a visual reminder and reassurance mechanism that operates through the power of expectation and symbolic comfort, similar to how a blanket over a child's head creates a sense of safety, not because it actually protects them from monsters, but because it represents a boundary and gives the mind something concrete to focus on as a protective object. The dreamcatcher's appeal also taps into our deep human need to exert some control over the chaotic realm of dreams, those 8 hours where our consciousness drifts into narratives we cannot consciously direct. And by placing this object in our bedroom, we create an illusion of agency, a sense that we have taken some action, however symbolic, to protect ourselves from the disturbing content our own minds generate while we sleep. What makes the persistence of dreamcatcher belief particularly interesting is that it has survived not only the scientific understanding of dreams as neurological phenomena with no physical existence, but has actually expanded far beyond its original cultural context into mainstream decorative culture, appearing in shopping malls and tourist shops worldwide, often manufactured by people with no connection to the traditions from which they emerged. Yet people continue to hang them believing in their protective power, or at least appreciating the comfort they provide, suggesting that we have somehow collectively agreed that certain objects can hold meaning and protective value even when we intellectually understand they operate through belief alone. Imagine waking in the dead of night to a thunderous sound, a percussive explosion that seems to originate from inside your own skull, a violent crack or boom that jolts you from sleep with your heart racing and your body drenched in sweat, only to discover that nothing in your environment could have possibly produced such a noise, that no external source exists to explain what you have just experienced. This is the peculiar phenomenon known as exploding head syndrome, a parasomnic event that occurs during the transition between sleep and wakefulness, manifesting as an imagined acoustic hallucination so vivid and so startling that it can cause genuine panic and distress to those who experience it. The sensation is entirely subjective, entirely internal, yet it feels absolutely real in the moment of occurrence, as though one's very consciousness has been shattered by some invisible force. People who suffer from these episodes often report hearing loud bangs, cymbal crashes, gunshots, or the sound of doors slamming with tremendous force, and the experience is frequently accompanied by a brief flash of light visible within the closed eyes, adding another layer of sensory confusion to an already disorienting phenomenon. The syndrome occurs most commonly during periods of high stress, irregular sleep schedules, or when an individual is experiencing significant fatigue, suggesting that the brain, in its transition between conscious and unconscious states, is essentially misfiring in its sensory processing centers, creating phantom sounds that feel absolutely genuine. Neurologically, what appears to be happening is that certain areas of the brain responsible for auditory processing become unexpectedly active during the hypnagogic or hypnopompic states, those twilight moments between sleep and wakefulness when the brain is neither fully asleep nor fully awake, and without the proper filtering mechanisms that normally suppress irrelevant sensory information, these random neural firings get interpreted as actual external sounds. The brain, in its confusion during this liminal state, constructs a narrative around these firing patterns, assigning them meaning and origin, creating an entire imagined acoustic event, complete with apparent source and direction. Consider the experience of falling asleep while listening to music, only to discover that the melody has woven itself directly into the fabric of your dream narrative, so that the song becomes the soundtrack to an entirely constructed scenario that your unconscious mind has generated in real time, transforming external auditory information into internal plot devices and emotional undercurrents that feel as though they originated from within the dream itself, rather than from your physical environment. This phenomenon, known as sensory incorporation, describes the remarkable capacity of the sleeping brain to detect and integrate ongoing sensory stimuli from the external world into the structure and content of dreams, creating a seamless merger between what is actually happening to your body and what your mind believes is happening within the dream space. When you sleep with your bedroom window open and a distant car horn sounds, your brain does not simply register this noise as background information. Instead, it transforms the honking into the blaring of a siren within a dream hospital, or the call of some fantastical creature, or the alarm announcing an urgent event that propels your dream narrative forward. The mechanism underlying this incorporation appears to involve a particular vulnerability in the brain's sensory gating systems during sleep, a state in which the neural barriers that typically filter irrelevant information become more permeable, allowing external stimuli to bypass normal processing channels and enter directly into the dream generation systems of the cortex. The temperature of your room, a partner shifting beside you in bed, the texture of your sheets, the ambient sounds of the household all become raw material that the dreaming brain incorporates into its constructed reality with remarkable efficiency and naturalness. What makes sensory incorporation particularly peculiar is that we have normalized this phenomenon so thoroughly that we rarely notice it is happening at all, accepting without question that the events of our dreams could plausibly include elements that were, in fact, generated by our sleeping body's interaction with external reality. We have constructed an intuitive understanding that dreams are somehow separate from waking life, and yet simultaneously we accept that they contain consistent references to physical sensations and environmental details.